They called him the Devil Duke, a man whose very name made servants cross themselves and mothers hide their daughters. When Lady Lillian Harrow's father announced her engagement to Duke Alexander Thornfield, London society didn't offer congratulations. They offered condolences. "That poor girl," they whispered at every ball, every tea party, "married to that creature." Even her own family looked at her with pity, as if she were walking to the gallows instead of the altar. But on her wedding night, when the scarred, silent Duke stood at her bedroom door, he asked one question that would change both their lives forever. "Are you afraid of me? Will Lillian survive marriage to England's most feared nobleman?" Stay until the end to discover how a bride everyone pitied became the woman who conquered the unconquerable Duke. And don't forget to like this video and comment which city you're watching from. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning in March 1847, delivered with all the warmth of a death sentence. Lillian stood in her father's study at Harrow House, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Through the tall windows behind Lord Harrow's desk, she could see the manicured gardens of their London estate, a view she had loved since childhood, now suddenly feeling like the last glimpse of freedom before prison doors closed. "The Duke of Thornfield has accepted my proposal," her father said, not looking up from the documents spread before him. His voice carried the satisfaction of a merchant who had just closed a particularly profitable deal. "The wedding will take place in 6 weeks." Lillian's mother, Lady Catherine Harrow, sat rigidly in the corner chair, her face carefully neutral. But Lillian saw the slight tremor in her mother's hands, the way she kept them folded in her lap as if to hide it. "Father," Lillian began, struggling to keep her voice steady, "I have never even met the Duke of Thornfield." "And yet he has met you." Lord Harrow finally looked up, his eyes cold and calculating in a way that had become increasingly familiar over the past year as their family's financial troubles deepened. "He observed you at the Pemberton Ball last season. Apparently you made quite an impression." Observed. The word sent ice down Lillian's spine. She remembered that ball, the oppressive heat, the crush of bodies, the constant scrutiny of society matrons evaluating her like livestock at market. She had no memory of the Duke of Thornfield being present, but then, according to the rumors, he was always watching from the shadows. "Mother, surely you cannot agree to this." Lillian turned to Lady Catherine, hearing the desperation creep into her voice despite her best efforts. "The things people say about him are mostly gossip," her mother interrupted, but the words lacked conviction. "Exaggerations, nothing more." "They say he killed his first fiancée," Lillian pressed. "They say Ravenhurst Hall is cursed, that servants refuse to work there, that he keeps the West Wing locked because—" "Enough!" Lord Harrow's fist hit the desk with a crack that made both women flinch. "I will not have my daughter repeating servants' gossip like some common washerwoman. The Duke of Thornfield is one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England. This marriage will save our family from ruin. That is the end of this discussion." Lillian felt the room tilt slightly. Save them from ruin. So it had come to that. She had known their finances were troubled, her father's poor investments, the debts that kept mounting, but she hadn't realized they were desperate enough to sell her to a monster. "You will conduct yourself with dignity befitting your station," Lord Harrow continued, his tone brooking no argument. "You will be an obedient wife, and you will be grateful for the opportunity to elevate this family's position." Grateful. The word tasted like ash in Lillian's mouth. Wasn't. The news spread through London society like wildfire through dry timber. Within hours of the announcement, Lillian became the subject of every whispered conversation, every sympathetic glance, every pitying smile that cut deeper than open contempt. The invitations that had once filled their entrance hall multiplied, not out of goodwill, but from morbid curiosity. Everyone wanted to see the bride destined for Ravenhurst Hall before she disappeared into its shadows forever. At Lady Ashworth's tea party 3 days later, Lillian sat in the drawing room surrounded by women who had once been her friends. Now they looked at her the way one might regard a beautiful vase about to be shattered. "My dear Lillian," Lady Ashworth herself poured tea with exaggerated care, her voice dripping with false concern. "We were all so surprised by your engagement announcement. The Duke of Thornfield rarely involves himself in society." "Rarely?" Miss Caroline Winters laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. The man is practically a hermit. I heard he hasn't attended a proper ball in over 15 years. Not since the tragedy, Mrs. Pemberton added in a stage whisper, leaning forward with the eager malice of someone about to share particularly delicious gossip. His younger brother died in that mine collapse at Ravenhurst, and on the very same day, his fiancée, beautiful Lady Margaret Ashford, was killed when her carriage overturned rushing to reach him. They say he watched her die. Lillian's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer. She set it down carefully on the side table, willing her hands to steady. "How absolutely dreadful," Lady Ashworth continued, clearly enjoying herself. "The whole family fell apart after that. The old Duke, Alexander's father, drank himself to death within 2 years. The Duchess went mad with grief and died shortly after. Left poor Alexander to inherit everything at 19. The title, the estates, the debts, and the curse." "Curse?" Lillian found her voice, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The women exchanged meaningful glances. "Well, my dear," Mrs. Pemberton patted Lillian's hand with clammy fingers, "tragedy does seem to follow the Thornfield family, doesn't it? Some say Ravenhurst Hall itself is cursed. Others say it's the Duke himself who brings misfortune to those around him." "I heard," Caroline Winters said, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "that he has a terrible scar across his entire face from the mine collapse. They say it makes him look quite monstrous." "Caroline," Lady Ashworth gasped with obvious delight, "you mustn't say such things." "But it's true. My cousin's maid worked at Ravenhurst for exactly 3 days before fleeing back to London. She said the Duke has the eyes of a dead man, cold, empty, terrifying. And he prowls the halls at night like a ghost, especially near that sealed wing where his brother died." Lillian felt her corset tightening, constricting her breath. The room suddenly seemed too hot, too small, the faces around her too eager, too cruel in their concern. "I'm sure Lillian's father knows what's best," Lady Ashworth said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "After all, the Harrows have been facing such difficulties lately. A wealthy duke must seem like quite the salvation, regardless of his reputation." The words hung in the air like a slap. Every woman in that room knew exactly what Lady Ashworth meant. Lillian was being sold to save her family from financial ruin, and the price was marriage to a man society had already condemned. "If you'll excuse me," Lillian rose abruptly, her chair scraping against polished wood. "I find I have a headache." No one tried to stop her as she fled. The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparations that felt more like arrangements for a funeral than a celebration. Lillian's mother accompanied her to dressmakers and jewelers, making all the correct choices while saying all the wrong things. "The Duke has sent his preferences for your wardrobe," Lady Catherine would announce, her voice carefully neutral. "He requests darker colors. He prefers simplicity over ostentation." Requests, as if Lillian had any choice in the matter. Her younger sister Sophie was the only family member who treated the situation with anything approaching honesty. At 17, Sophie still possessed the directness that society had not yet beaten out of her. "I don't understand," Sophie said one evening, sitting on Lillian's bed while her older sister stared out the window at the darkening London streets. "Why won't Father let you refuse? Surely there must be other options." "There are no other options, Sophie." Lillian's breath fogged the window glass. "Father has borrowed against everything, the house, the lands, even Mother's jewels. If the Duke withdraws his offer, we lose everything. Mother and you would be left with nothing. No dowry, no prospects, no future." "So you're sacrificing yourself for us," Sophie's voice cracked. "That's not fair, Lily." "Life rarely is." "Have you at least tried to contact the Duke? To meet him before the wedding? Perhaps the rumors are exaggerated. Perhaps he's not as terrible as people say." Lillian had tried. She had written 3 letters to Ravenhurst Hall, each more carefully worded than the last, requesting an audience, a conversation, anything that might give her some understanding of the man she was being forced to marry. The Duke had not replied to a single one. His silence spoke louder than words. She was not a future partner, not even a person in his eyes. She was simply an acquisition, selected from a distance and purchased through her father. The night before the wedding, Lillian stood in front of her mirror while her mother fastened a necklace around her throat, a Harrow family heirloom that had been in their possession for generations. "You look beautiful," Lady Catherine whispered, but tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry, Lillian. I wish things were different." It was the first time her mother had acknowledged the horror of what was happening. The first time anyone in her family had admitted that they were condemning her to a future they wouldn't wish on their worst enemy. Lillian reached up and squeezed her mother's hand. "I know, Mother. I know." But knowing changed nothing. The wedding took place at dawn in a small chapel on the outskirts of London. There was no grand ceremony, no crowd of well-wishers, no celebration. The Duke had insisted on a private affair, another command delivered through intermediaries, as if he couldn't be bothered to speak to his future wife directly. Lillian arrived with her family in a carriage that felt more like a hearse. Her wedding dress was beautiful, ivory silk with delicate lace, a creation that had cost more than most families earned in a year, but it felt like a costume for a play in which she had never auditioned. Inside the chapel, the air was cold despite the spring morning. A handful of witnesses sat in the pews. Her parents, Sophie, a few distant Thornfield relatives who looked uncomfortable, and several estate managers who probably only attended to ensure the legal documents were properly executed. And at the altar, waiting with the priest, stood Duke Alexander Thornfield. Lillian's first thought, seeing him, was that the rumors had been both wrong and horrifyingly insufficient. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his dark coat with an almost military bearing. His hair was black as coal, pulled back from his face in a severe style that emphasized the harsh angles of his features. And yes, there was a scar, a pale line that ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone, disappearing beneath his jaw. But it wasn't monstrous. It was simply part of a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by an artist who valued strength over beauty. But it was his eyes that made Lillian's breath catch, gray as a winter storm and just as cold. "Empty," Caroline Winters had said. "Dead," the servant had claimed. But Lillian saw something else in those eyes as the Duke watched her approach, something worse than emptiness or death. Recognition, resignation, the look of a man attending his own execution with perfect composure. He didn't want this marriage any more than she did. The realization should have been comforting. Instead, it made everything worse. They were two prisoners chained together, each resenting the other for a circumstance neither had chosen. The ceremony was brutally brief. The priest rushed through the vows as if afraid the Duke might change his mind or simply disappear back to Ravenhurst without completing the transaction. Lillian heard herself speaking the words, "I do. I will. Until death." But they sounded like they were coming from someone else, some other woman wearing her dress and her face. When the priest announced them married, the Duke turned to face her for the first time. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. He stood so near she could see the faint silver threads in his dark hair, the sharp intelligence in those storm-gray eyes, the tension in his jaw suggesting a man holding himself under rigid control. "Lady Thornfield," he said. His voice was low, measured, with an edge like steel scraping stone. Not Lillian, not his wife even, just the title he had purchased. He did not kiss her. The priest, clearly flustered by this departure from tradition, stammered something about the register, and the Duke turned away to sign the marriage documents without another word. It was done. Lillian Harrow had ceased to exist. In her place stood the Duchess of Thornfield, a woman married to a stranger who couldn't even look at her without visible discomfort. The carriage ride to Ravenhurst Hall took 6 hours, each one stretching longer than the last. The Duke rode on horseback alongside the carriage, maintaining a careful distance. Through the window, Lillian could see him, back straight, expression unreadable, a man clearly more comfortable with solitude than with the wife he had just acquired. Inside the carriage, Lillian was alone with her thoughts and her fear. As London disappeared behind them and the landscape turned wilder, she tried to remember everything she knew about her new husband. The facts were sparse and contradictory. He was 39 years old. He had inherited the dukedom at 19 after the tragedy that killed his brother and his fiancée in a single day. He had rebuilt the Thornfield fortune through ruthless efficiency, turning failing estates into profitable enterprises. He never attended social events. He never took mistresses. He never, according to society gossip, showed emotion of any kind. A living ghost, one matron had called him. A man who had died with his brother 20 years ago, but whose body hadn't yet realized it. The sun was setting when they finally reached Ravenhurst Hall. The estate sat on a wild stretch of Yorkshire moorland, isolated from neighboring properties by miles of rough terrain. The hall itself was an imposing stone structure, 3 stories of dark granite with a tower on one end and what looked like a newer wing on the other. Behind the main building, Lillian could see the dark outline of an old mine entrance, sealed with heavy timbers and iron bars. The site of the tragedy. The place where the Duke's brother had died and his fiancée had followed. The carriage stopped. Moments later, the door opened, and the Duke stood there, offering his hand to help her down. It was the first time he had touched her. His hand was warm despite the evening chill, his grip firm but not painful. He released her the moment her feet touched the ground, as if the contact had burned him. "The household has prepared your rooms," he said, gesturing toward the entrance where an elderly woman in a housekeeper's uniform waited. "Mrs. Brennan will show you upstairs. Dinner will be served at 8. "Thank you, Your Grace," Lillian managed. Something flickered across his face, discomfort, perhaps, or irritation. "Alexander," he said curtly, "you need not use titles in private. We are married." The way he said the word made it sound like a disease. Before Lillian could respond, he turned and strode toward the stables, leaving her standing alone in the courtyard of her new home. Mrs. Brennan was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair, sharp eyes, and an expression that suggested she had seen everything life could throw at her and remained unimpressed by all of it. "Welcome to Ravenhurst Hall, Your Grace," she said, her Yorkshire accent thick but her tone professional. "I've been housekeeper here for 30 years. If you need anything, you need only ask." She led Lillian through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on dark wood paneling. The hall was well-maintained but austere. No unnecessary decorations, no portraits on the walls, nothing to suggest this was a home rather than a fortress. "The Duke has assigned you the Duchess's suite in the East Wing," Mrs. Brennan explained as they climbed a wide staircase. "It hasn't been used since the old Duchess died, but we've had it thoroughly cleaned and prepared for your arrival." "And the Duke's rooms?" "West Wing, opposite side of the house. As far from her as possible," Lillian noted. Even in his own home, Alexander Thornfield was maintaining distance from his unwanted wife. The Duchess's suite was larger than Lillian's entire bedroom at Harrow House. The sitting room opened onto a bedroom with a massive 4-poster bed, heavy curtains, and windows that overlooked the moorland. Everything was clean, well-appointed, and utterly devoid of personality. "Your trunks are being brought up now," Mrs. Brennan said. "I'll send a maid to help you dress for dinner. Is there anything else you require, Your Grace?" "Yes," Lillian wanted to scream. An explanation, a kind word, some indication that I haven't just been purchased and warehoused like furniture. "No, thank you, Mrs. Brennan." The housekeeper nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Your Grace, the Duke is a good man, a hard man perhaps, and not one for easy conversation, but he's fair and he's never cruel. You'll be safe here." Safe. The word echoed in Lillian's mind long after Mrs. Brennan had left. She supposed safe was better than the alternatives, but it was a poor substitute for happiness, for partnership, for anything resembling an actual marriage. Dinner was served in a dining room large enough to seat 40 people but set for only 2. Lillian arrived promptly at 8, dressed in one of the new gowns the Duke had selected, a deep burgundy silk that was beautiful and conservative in equal measure. Alexander was already there, standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, as he stared out at the darkening moors. He turned when she entered, and for a moment something passed across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation, before the mask of cold composure slammed back into place. "Lady Thornfield," he said, pulling out a chair for her at one end of the long table. He sat at the other end, a distance of perhaps 15 feet separating them. The meal was exquisite: roasted pheasant, winter vegetables preserved from last season, bread still warm from the ovens, but Lillian could barely taste it. She watched the Duke from the corner of her eye as servants moved silently around them, serving each course with practiced efficiency. Alexander ate mechanically, as if food were merely fuel rather than pleasure. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. The only sounds were the clink of silverware and the crackle of the fire in the massive hearth. Finally, Lillian couldn't bear the silence any longer. "The hall is very beautiful," she ventured. "Thank you." 2 words, delivered without inflection. "How large are the grounds?" 15,000 acres. "And the tenants? Are there many families on the estate?" 47. Alexander set down his fork with careful precision. "Mrs. Brennan has prepared a full accounting of the household operations. You'll receive it tomorrow." He was answering her questions with the bare minimum of information, making it clear that conversation was an obligation to be endured rather than enjoyed. Lillian felt something inside her, the fear that had gripped her for weeks, begin to transform into anger. She had been sold like property, married without consent, brought to this isolated estate, and now she was expected to sit in silence while her husband treated her like an inconvenient piece of furniture. "Your Grace, Alexander," she corrected herself, remembering his earlier instruction. "May I ask you something?" He looked up, those gray eyes meeting hers directly for the first time since the wedding. "You may." "Why did you choose me?" The question hung in the air between them. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached for his wine glass, took a long drink, and set it down before answering. "I saw you at the Pemberton ball last year," he said, finally. "You were standing on the terrace, away from the crowd. Lady Ashworth was holding court inside, making cruel commentary about another young woman's dress. You heard her. I saw your face. Disgust, anger, but you didn't join in the mockery. Instead, you went inside and asked the woman to dance. Drew attention away from the ridicule." Lillian remembered that moment. The woman had been Miss Eleanor Gray, a baron's daughter with more kindness than fashion sense. Lady Ashworth had been vicious in her commentary. It hadn't been heroic to intervene. It had simply been decent. "That told me," Alexander continued, "that you possess something rare in London society, actual courage and compassion. I needed a wife. I required someone who wouldn't crumble under social pressure or the difficulties of life at Ravenhurst. Your father was willing. The arrangement was made." It was the longest speech he had made all evening, and somehow it made everything worse. "So you selected me the way one might select a horse," Lillian said quietly. "Based on observed temperament and breeding, I selected you," Alexander said, steel entering his voice, "because I thought you capable of surviving this marriage without becoming bitter or broken. I apologize if you find that insufficient." He stood abruptly, throwing his napkin onto the table. "Excuse me. I have estate matters to attend to." He was halfway to the door when Lillian's voice stopped him. "Alexander?" He paused but didn't turn around. "Will you at least tell me the truth about one thing?" Lillian stood, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "The things they say about you. About tragedy, following your name. About the curse on Ravenhurst. Are any of them true?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his shoulders rose and fell in what might have been a sigh. "Yes," he said simply. "All of it." "Good evening, Lady Thornfield." And then he was gone, leaving Lillian alone in the enormous dining room with only the servants' pitying glances for company. But the house was silent as Lillian climbed the stairs to her suite hours later. She had remained in the drawing room after dinner, trying to read from the Duke's impressive library, but the words had blurred on the page. Finally, exhausted from the day's emotional turmoil, she surrendered to the inevitable and prepared for bed. Her new maid, a young woman named Mary, had helped her out of the burgundy gown and into a white nightdress that was both beautiful and utterly impractical. Now Lillian sat at the vanity while Mary brushed out her dark hair, both women silent, each lost in their own thoughts. "That will be all, Mary," Lillian said finally. "Thank you." "Are you certain, Your Grace?" "I can stay, if you—" "I'm certain. Good night." The maid left reluctantly, clearly expecting to be summoned back at any moment for some disaster or another. Lillian stared at her reflection in the mirror. The Duchess of Thornfield looked back at her, pale, wide-eyed, terrified. Nothing like the confident woman she had pretended to be at dinner. A knock at the door made her jump. For a moment she couldn't move. It was past midnight. There was only one person who would be knocking at her door at this hour. "Come in," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The door opened and Alexander Thornfield stood in the doorway. He was still fully dressed, though he had removed his jacket and cravat. His shirt was open at the collar, revealing the strong column of his throat. In the candlelight, the scar on his face seemed less severe, more like a mark of survival than damage. He didn't enter the room. Instead, he remained in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame as if to anchor himself there. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, his voice low. "I should have sent word, but I needed to speak with you before... He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Lillian rose from the vanity, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, then. The moment every whispered conversation had warned her about. The terrifying Duke had come to claim his marital rights, to take what he had purchased. She forced herself to meet his eyes, to show no fear even though she was drowning in it. "What is it you need to say, Alexander?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in those gray eyes, something almost like pain. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked quietly. The question was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that Lillian found herself answering honestly before she could think better of it. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I am." Alexander nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. "Then I will make you one promise," he said. "I will never enter this room again unless you invite me. I will never touch you unless you desire it. I will never force my company upon you beyond what society requires. You have my word." Lillian stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "But we're married. You have every legal right." "I have," Alexander interrupted, "no rights that supersede your consent. The ceremony today gave me title to lands and properties. It did not give me ownership of you." "I don't understand," Lillian said, shaking her head. "Why marry at all, then? Why go through all of this if you don't intend to—" "To consummate the marriage?" Alexander finished bluntly. "Because I needed the alliance with your father's connections in Parliament. Because the estate requires a duchess to manage social obligations I cannot fulfill. Because my heir, a distant cousin, is an incompetent wastrel who would destroy Ravenhurst in a year. There are many practical reasons for this marriage, Lady Thornfield, but forcing myself on a terrified woman is not among them." He stepped back from the door, preparing to leave. "Good night," he said. "Sleep well. Alexander, wait." He paused, looking back at her. Lillian didn't know what she wanted to say. She only knew that this moment, this unexpected mercy from a man society called a monster, deserved acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said finally, "for your promise, for your honor." Something flickered across his scarred face, surprise perhaps, or gratitude, or something too complex to name. "There is little enough honor left in me," he said softly, "but what remains is yours." And then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving Lillian alone with the revolutionary realization that the Duke of Thornfield might be the only honorable man she had ever met. The first week at Ravenhurst Hall passed like a fever dream, surreal, disorienting, and impossible to escape. Lillian woke each morning in the Duchess's suite to find breakfast already laid out in her sitting room, her clothes selected and pressed, her bath drawn to the precise temperature Mrs. Brennan had somehow determined she preferred. The household ran with mechanical efficiency, servants appearing and disappearing like ghosts, everything managed to perfection without her input or presence required. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, and the bars were made of propriety and distance. Alexander kept his promise with ruthless consistency. He did not enter her chambers. He did not seek her company. In fact, Lillian barely saw him at all during those first days. He took breakfast in his study before dawn, worked the estate throughout the day, and dined alone in the library most evenings. When they did cross paths in the corridors, he would nod politely, murmur, "Lady Thornfield," and continue on his way as if she were merely another piece of furniture in his ancestral home. It should have been a relief. Instead, it was maddening. On the 8th day of her marriage, Lillian decided she had endured enough. She found Mrs. Brennan in the housekeeper's office, a small room off the main kitchen where the older woman managed the complex operations of the estate with ledgers, correspondence, and what appeared to be an iron will. "Your Grace," Mrs. Brennan rose immediately, surprise evident on her weathered face. "Is something wrong? Has Mary not been attending to your needs properly?" "Mary is wonderful," Lillian assured her. "I came to speak with you about the household operations. You mentioned you had prepared an accounting for me?" Mrs. Brennan's expression shifted to something between confusion and concern. "The Duke hasn't given you the ledgers yet." "The Duke," Lillian said carefully, "has been occupied with estate business. I thought perhaps I should take initiative." Understanding dawned in the housekeeper's eyes. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Your Grace. We need to have a conversation." Over the next hour, Mrs. Brennan laid out the reality of Ravenhurst Hall with the bluntness of someone who had seen 3 generations of Thornfields rise and fall. "The household staff numbers 32 people," she explained, showing Lillian ledgers filled with names, wages, and responsibilities. "We've had trouble keeping maids and footmen over the years. The isolation bothers them, and the rumors about the Duke don't help matters. But those who stay are loyal, good people who understand His Grace isn't the monster London makes him out to be." "And the estate itself?" Lillian asked, studying the columns of numbers. "Profitable now, though it wasn't always. When the old Duke died, Ravenhurst was drowning in debt. The mine collapse didn't just kill the young master, it destroyed the primary source of income. Alexander, His Grace, spent 15 years rebuilding everything from scratch: the tenant farms, the timber operations, the investments. He saved this place through sheer bloody-mindedness, if you'll pardon my language, Your Grace." Lillian thought of the cold, distant man who barely spoke to her. It was hard to reconcile him with the determined 19-year-old who had salvaged a dying estate from catastrophe. "Mrs. Brennan, may I ask you something honestly?" "Always, Your Grace." "Is there truly a curse on this house?" The housekeeper's face grew somber. She closed the ledger in front of her and folded her hands on top of it. "I don't believe in curses," she said slowly. "I believe in grief and guilt, and men who punish themselves for tragedies they couldn't prevent. The day Master Edmund died in that mine, and Lady Margaret's carriage overturned trying to reach Ravenhurst, that day broke something in His Grace. He was supposed to be in the mine that morning, you see. He and Edmund were meant to inspect the new shaft together, but Alexander was delayed in the village settling a dispute with a tenant. Edmund went alone." "So Alexander blames himself," Lillian said quietly. "For 20 years, yes, and London society's cruelty hasn't helped. They whisper about curses and monsters, but what they really mean is that Alexander Thornfield makes them uncomfortable. He won't play their games, won't attend their parties, won't pretend grief and guilt can be hidden behind false smiles. So they've made him into a villain in their stories." Lillian felt something shift in her chest, anger, but not at Alexander. At the society that had mocked her for this marriage, that had looked at her with pity, that had condemned both of them without understanding or mercy. "Mrs. Brennan," she said, straightening her shoulders with new resolve, "I want to learn everything about managing this household. I want to meet the staff individually, review the accounts, understand the operations. If I'm to be the Duchess of Ravenhurst, I intend to actually be one, not simply wear the title." For the first time since Lillian had arrived, Mrs. Brennan smiled, a real smile that transformed her stern face. "Well then, Your Grace," she said, reopening her ledgers. "We'd best get started. There's 20 years of isolation to undo, and we haven't got all day." The transformation began quietly, but the household noticed immediately. Lillian started appearing in parts of Ravenhurst Hall that had rarely seen a duchess's presence. She visited the kitchens and learned the cook's name, Mrs. Patterson, a formidable woman who had been feeding the Thornfield family for 30 years. She walked through the servants' quarters and noted which rooms needed repairs, which chimneys weren't drawing properly, which windows let in too much cold wind from the moors. She met the stable master, Thomas Hewitt, who had served Alexander's father and spoke of the current duke with gruff respect. "His Grace knows every horse by name," Thomas told her while showing her the breeding records. "Comes out here most mornings before dawn. Rides the estate boundary alone, checking on tenants, inspecting fences. Man works harder than any lord I've ever known." She attended to correspondence that had piled up unanswered, social invitations that had been ignored for years, letters from distant Thornfield relatives who had been shut out of Alexander's life, requests from charitable organizations in the nearby village of Thornmere. And slowly, carefully, she began making changes. She ordered repairs to the servants' quarters. She established regular tea service in the drawing room for any household staff who wanted to speak with her privately about concerns. She wrote polite responses to the social invitations, explaining that the Duke and Duchess would be remaining at Ravenhurst for the foreseeable future, but appreciated the consideration. The staff responded with cautious gratitude. Mrs. Brennan became a staunch ally. Even Mary, her young maid, began volunteering information about the estate without being asked. But Alexander noticed nothing. He continued his pattern of avoidance, maintaining his distance as if Lillian were a dangerous animal that might attack if approached too closely. They crossed paths perhaps twice a day, a nod in the corridor, a murmured greeting over breakfast if they happened to be in the dining room at the same time. He never asked about her activities, never inquired about her comfort or happiness. It was as if she simply didn't exist to him beyond the requirements of basic courtesy. On the 15th day of her marriage, Lillian's patience finally snapped. She found him in the estate office, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, working by lamplight even though it was barely past noon. The room was austere. No decorations, no personal touches, just a massive desk, filing cabinets, and walls lined with maps of the Ravenhurst properties. Alexander looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face before the usual mask of cold politeness slammed into place. "Lady Thornfield, is something wrong? May I speak with you?" "Of course." He set down his pen but remained seated, clearly expecting a brief conversation about household matters before she returned to her separate existence. Lillian closed the door behind her. That got his attention. His eyebrows rose slightly, and he stood, wariness entering his posture. "I've been here for 2 weeks," Lillian said without preamble. "I've learned the names of every servant in this house. I've reviewed the household accounts, toured the estate buildings, and begun correspondence with the tenants. I've done everything a duchess should do except the one thing that apparently matters most in this house." "And what is that?" Alexander asked carefully. "I haven't managed to have a single meaningful conversation with my husband." Something that might have been guilt crossed his face. "I gave you my word that I wouldn't force my presence. And you've kept that word admirably," Lillian interrupted. "So admirably that you've barely spoken 10 sentences to me since the wedding. You avoid me as if I carry the plague. We live in the same house, but might as well be on different continents." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I thought you would prefer the distance. Most women in your position, most women in my position," Lillian said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm, "are not me. I did not ask for this marriage. I did not choose to be sold to save my family from ruin. But I am here, Alexander. I am your wife, whether either of us wanted it or not. And I refuse to spend the rest of my life being treated like an inconvenient obligation you must occasionally acknowledge." For the first time since their wedding night, she saw genuine emotion in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something like respect. "What exactly do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "I want honesty," Lillian said. "I want to understand who you are beyond the rumors and the reputation. I want to know if we might possibly build something resembling an actual partnership, or if I should resign myself to spending the next 50 years in beautiful isolation while you pretend I don't exist." The silence that followed was so complete Lillian could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Alexander moved to the window, staring out at the moorland with his hands clasped behind his back, a pose she was beginning to recognize as his default when uncomfortable. "You deserve better than this," he said finally. "Better than me, better than Ravenhurst, better than a marriage arranged for political convenience. Your father should have been horsewhipped for what he did to you." "Perhaps," Lillian agreed, "but this is the reality we're both living in. The question is what we do with it." He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw past the cold exterior to the exhaustion underneath. A man who had been carrying impossible weight for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "I don't know how to be a husband," Alexander admitted. "I was engaged once, briefly, before everything fell apart. But that was 20 years ago, and I was a different man. The man I am now isn't fit for companionship of any kind." "Why not?" "Because everything I touch turns to ashes," he said flatly. "My brother, my fiancé, my parents. Everyone close to me dies or disappears. I will not add you to that list." There it was, the heart of his isolation, laid bare. Not cruelty or disinterest, but fear. Bone-deep terror that caring for someone, letting them close, would somehow condemn them to the same fate as everyone else he had loved. "That's not how tragedy works," Lillian said gently. "You're not cursed, Alexander. You're grieving. There's a difference. You don't understand. Then help me understand." She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "Talk to me. Tell me what happened that day. Tell me why you're so convinced you're dangerous to be near." Alexander stared at her as if she had suggested he cut out his own heart and hand it over. "Why?" he demanded. "Why does it matter to you? You could live comfortably here without ever knowing the details. You could have everything you need except me, and that would surely be preferable. Because I'm tired of being alone." The words burst out before Lillian could stop them. "I've been alone in my family's house, surrounded by parents who cared more about social status than my well-being. I've been alone in London society, where friendships are transactions, and everyone's waiting for you to fail so they can gossip about it. And now I'm alone in this beautiful, isolated estate with a husband who treats me like I'm made of glass. I don't want your guilt or your penance, Alexander. I just want honesty. Is that truly too much to ask?" The silence stretched so long, Lillian thought he might simply refuse, might return to his ledgers and dismiss her from his presence. But then Alexander moved to the desk, opened a locked drawer with a key from his pocket, and pulled out a worn leather journal. "This was Edmund's," he said, holding the journal like it might shatter. "His diary from the months before he died. If you want to understand what happened, read it, but don't expect the understanding to change anything between us." He held out the journal. Lillian took it carefully, aware that she was being trusted with something precious and painful. "Will you tell me about him?" she asked. "Not just the tragedy, but who he was." For the first time since they had met, Alexander's expression softened, just a fraction, just for a moment, but enough to show her the man he might have been if grief hadn't carved out his humanity. "Edmund was 17 when he died," Alexander said quietly. "Brilliant, reckless, full of ideas about modernizing the estate operations. He wanted to expand the mine, increase production, make Ravenhurst profitable again. I should have stopped him, should have recognized that the new shaft wasn't properly reinforced. But I was young and stupid and so focused on our financial problems that I didn't see the danger until it was too late." "That doesn't make it your fault." "Doesn't it?" His voice turned hard again. "I was the elder brother, the heir. My responsibility was to protect him, and I failed spectacularly." Lillian opened her mouth to argue, but Alexander raised a hand to stop her. "You asked for honesty," he said. "Here it is. I am not capable of the kind of marriage you deserve. I don't know how to be close to someone without fear. I don't know how to trust that disaster won't follow. The best I can offer you is a comfortable life, distance, and the knowledge that you'll be provided for if anything happens to me. It's not much, but it's all I have." It was the saddest thing Lillian had ever heard. A man so convinced of his own toxicity that he had sentenced himself to eternal isolation. "Then I'll have to settle for what you can give," she said, "and hope that someday you realize you're worth more than your worst memories." Something shifted in Alexander's face, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of hope quickly smothered. "You should return to your rooms," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Dinner will be served at 8, as usual." Lillian recognized the dismissal for what it was, not cruelty, but self-protection. A man retreating behind familiar walls before he revealed too much. She moved toward the door, still clutching Edmund's journal. "Alexander?" He looked up from the papers he had already returned his attention to. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me with this." His nod was barely perceptible, but it was acknowledgement nonetheless. As Lillian climbed the stairs to her suite, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. The Duke of Ravenhurst wasn't the monster society painted him to be. He was just a man carrying impossible grief, convinced he had to carry it alone. And Lillian was beginning to suspect that the only way to survive this marriage was to prove him wrong. She read Edmund's journal that night by candlelight, and what she found there broke her heart. The entries spanned from January through early March of 1827, written in an enthusiastic, slightly messy hand that spoke of youth and energy. Edmund Thornfield had been everything his older brother wasn't: optimistic, social, prone to dreaming big dreams without always calculating the cost. January 15th, 1827. Alexander returned from London today, more grim than usual. Father is worse. The drinking has progressed beyond anything the doctors can manage. Mother barely leaves her rooms. Sometimes I think Alexander and I are the only ones keeping Ravenhurst from collapsing entirely. He works himself to exhaustion, managing everything while I'm supposed to be learning estate management. But learning is so bloody boring when there are actual problems to solve. February 3rd. Had another argument with Alex about the mine expansion. He thinks it's too dangerous, that we should focus on the tenant farms instead. But the farms will take years to show profit, and we need money now. The mine could save us if we just modernize the operation. Why can't he see that? February 28th. Margaret came to visit today. She's so patient with Alexander's moods, so understanding of the pressure he's under. I think she might be the only person besides me who sees how much he's sacrificing to save this place. They're to be married in June. At least one of us will be happy. March 7th. The new mine shaft is nearly complete. I've been overseeing the work myself since Alex is too busy with the tenant disputes. The engineer says we could be extracting coal within a fortnight. This will save us. I know it will. The final entry was dated March 9th, 1827, the day Edmund died. Early morning, Alex was supposed to meet me at the mine at dawn to inspect the new shaft before we begin operations. He sent word he's delayed in Thornmere dealing with some farmer's boundary dispute. Typical. Always putting everyone else's problems before our own. I'll go alone. Someone needs to ensure everything is ready, and I'm perfectly capable of a simple inspection. We'll update tonight with good news. The page ended there. Lillian set the journal down with shaking hands, tears blurring her vision. Edmund had gone into that mine confident and capable, excited about solving his family's problems. He hadn't known the shaft was unstable, hadn't realized the engineer had cut corners to save money and time. And when the collapse came, it had buried him under tons of rock and earth, while his brother was miles away settling a pointless dispute about property lines. No wonder Alexander blamed himself. And Margaret, his fiancée, had been riding to Ravenhurst when news of the collapse reached her. According to Mrs. Brennan, she had pushed the horses too hard, too fast, desperate to reach Alexander. Her carriage had overturned on the treacherous moorland roads. She had died before reaching the estate, before seeing the man she loved one last time. 2 deaths in a single day, both connected to Alexander's choices: his delay in the village, his decision to let Edmund go alone, his very existence creating the circumstances for catastrophe. It wasn't logical, it wasn't fair. But Lillian could understand now why Alexander had constructed walls around himself, why he refused to let anyone close. In his mind, love was lethal. Attachment meant death. The next morning, Lillian found Alexander in the stables at dawn. He was standing in a stall with a massive black stallion, running a brush along the horse's flank with methodical strokes. He wore simple clothes. No coat, no cravat, just a white shirt and dark trousers that emphasized how much of his intimidating presence came from bearing rather than finery. He looked up when she entered, surprise evident in his expression. "You're awake early," he said, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "I read Edmund's journal." Alexander's hand stilled on the brush. For a moment she thought he might order her to leave. Instead, he returned his attention to the horse, continuing the grooming with careful precision. "Then you understand why I am the way I am." I understand that you've spent 20 years punishing yourself for circumstances beyond your control, Lillian said, moving closer to the stall. Edmund was 17 and reckless. He made his own choice to enter that mine alone. That's not your fault. I was his older brother. His protection was my responsibility. He was nearly a grown man, Alexander. You cannot control every action of every person in your life. That's not protection. That's imprisonment. The stallion shifted, sensing the tension in the stable. Alexander stroked its neck soothingly, his jaw tight. Margaret died because of me, he said flatly. If I hadn't needed comfort, if she hadn't been rushing to reach me, then she might have died in a different accident at a different time, or lived to old age, or been struck by lightning, Lillian interrupted. You cannot know the shape of a life that never happened. You can only live the one you have. Alexander finally looked at her directly, those storm-gray eyes filled with something raw and painful. I have lived, he said quietly. For 20 years I have lived. I rebuilt this estate. I saved the tenants from poverty. I honored my responsibilities and my title. But I will not allow myself the luxury of caring for someone again, only to watch tragedy take them. I will not do it. Then you're not living, Lillian said. You're existing. There's a difference. Before Alexander could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from outside the stable. Moments later, Thomas Hewitt appeared in the doorway, his weathered face tight with concern. Your Grace, he addressed Alexander urgently. Ryder just came from the village. There's been an accident at the old mine entrance. Some of the local boys were playing near the sealed shaft. Part of the timber collapsed and trapped 2 of them inside. The color drained from Alexander's face. How long ago? He demanded, already moving toward the tack room. Maybe 20 minutes. The village men are organizing a rescue party, but they're asking for your Grace's help. You know the mine layout better than anyone. Lillian watched Alexander saddle his horse with swift, practiced movements. His hands were steady, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. The old mine, the place where his brother died, was calling him back to the site of his greatest failure. I'm going with you, she said. Absolutely not. Alexander swung into the saddle without looking at her. It's dangerous. The whole structure could be unstable. Which is exactly why you shouldn't go alone. Lady Thornfield. I am your wife, Lillian said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. If you're riding into danger, I'm coming with you. Thomas, saddle me a horse, now. Alexander looked like he wanted to argue, but the clock was ticking. Every moment they wasted was another moment those boys were trapped underground. Fine, he bit out, but you follow my instructions exactly. If I tell you to leave, you leave. Understood? Understood. 5 minutes later, they were riding hard across the moorland toward the old mine, with Thomas and 2 other stable hands following behind. The morning sun was rising over the hills, painting everything gold and crimson, beautiful and entirely wrong for the crisis unfolding. As they approached the sealed mine entrance, Lillian could see a crowd of villagers gathered, men, women, children, all wearing expressions of terror and helplessness. The timber barricade that had sealed the entrance for 20 years had partially collapsed, leaving a dark opening barely large enough for a child to squeeze through. Alexander dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, immediately taking command of the situation with a natural authority that transformed him from the isolated Duke into something else entirely, a leader, a protector, a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. How many boys? He demanded of the man who appeared to be the village constable. 2, Your Grace. Tommy Fletcher, age 10, and his brother William, age 8. They were playing near the entrance when the timbers gave way. Tommy managed to pull William inside before the collapse, but now they're trapped somewhere in the first chamber. Are they injured? Don't know, Your Grace. We can hear them crying, but they're too far in to see. Alexander knelt at the opening, peering into the darkness. Lillian could see his hands shaking, just slightly, just enough to betray the terror he was fighting. The support beams are rotted, he said, standing and addressing the gathered men. Any attempt to widen this opening could bring down the entire entrance. We need to go in carefully, shore up the passage as we go, and bring the boys out one at a time. Your Grace, the constable said hesitantly, with respect, nobody here knows the mine layout like you do, but that's also where Master Edmund, I'm aware, Alexander cut him off coldly, which is precisely why I'm going in. Someone get me rope, lanterns, and timber supports. Now. The men scattered to obey. Lillian moved to Alexander's side, keeping her voice low. You don't have to do this. You could supervise from out here. Those boys are terrified and trapped in the dark, Alexander said, not looking at her. I will not abandon them to that fate simply because I'm afraid of my own memories. I know, but... He finally turned to her, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Not coldness, not distance, but raw determination and something else. Something almost like gratitude that she was there, bearing witness to this moment. If I don't come back out, he said quietly, Mrs. Brennan has instructions for the estate management. You'll be provided for. The properties are all secured. Don't, Lillian interrupted fiercely. Don't you dare talk like you're planning to die in there. I'm not planning to, Alexander said, but I am prepared for the possibility. There's a difference. Before she could respond, the men returned with equipment. Alexander began organizing the rescue with military precision. Who would hold the rope? Who would pass supplies? Who would keep the crowd back from the unstable entrance? Then he lit a lantern, secured a rope around his waist, and lowered himself through the narrow opening into the darkness that had haunted him for 20 years. The wait was agony. Lillian stood at the entrance with the other villagers, listening to the muffled sounds from below. Alexander's voice calling to the boys, the creak of old timbers, the shifting of loose rock. Every sound made her heart lurch, expecting the worst. He's a brave man, the Duke, one of the village women said quietly beside her. People in London don't know what he's really like. But here we know. He saved this village a dozen times over, with jobs, with medicine, with whatever we needed, and now he's risking his life for our boys. Lillian could only nod, unable to speak past the fear crushing her chest. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Just when Lillian was about to insist someone else go down to help, there was movement at the entrance. Alexander's voice called up, "Take the first boy!" Willing hands reached down and pulled up a small, crying child, Tommy Fletcher, dirty and terrified but apparently uninjured. His mother rushed forward, sobbing with relief. "William's coming next," Alexander's voice echoed from below. "He's got a twisted ankle, but he's conscious. Prepare to lift carefully." Minutes later, the second boy emerged, whimpering in pain but alive. Then silence. Lillian's heart hammered as she waited for Alexander to emerge. The seconds stretched like hours. Finally, she saw his hands grip the edge of the opening. He hauled himself out of the mine, covered in dirt and sweat, his white shirt torn, but whole and breathing and alive. Their eyes met across the crowd, and something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, understanding, the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. The villagers erupted in cheers. Men clapped Alexander on the back. Women blessed him. The Fletcher family tried to drop to their knees in gratitude, but Alexander stopped them gruffly, insisting he had only done what anyone would do. But Lillian knew better. The Duke of Ravenhurst had just confronted his worst nightmare and won. He had gone back into the mine that killed his brother, faced the darkness that had defined his life for 2 decades, and brought 2 children safely into the light. It wasn't redemption. Tragedy couldn't be undone, but it was a beginning. On the ride back to Ravenhurst Hall, with the sun climbing higher and the moorland spreading endless around them, Alexander rode beside her instead of ahead. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had happened, for what it meant. But when they finally dismounted in the stable yard, and Lillian stumbled slightly from exhaustion and relief, Alexander caught her arm to steady her. He didn't release her immediately. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being there, for coming with me." "I'm your wife," Lillian said, meeting his eyes. "Where else would I be?" For the first time since their wedding, Alexander smiled, just a small, brief curve of his lips, gone almost before she registered it. But it transformed his entire face, giving her a glimpse of the man he might have been, might still become. "Come," he said, finally releasing her arm but staying close. "You should rest. Today was extraordinary," Lillian finished. Today was extraordinary. And as they walked together toward the house, not touching, but no longer maintaining careful distance, Lillian felt the first stirring of hope that this marriage might become something more than a prison sentence for them both. The days following the mine rescue brought changes to Ravenhurst Hall that no one could have predicted. Alexander began appearing at dinner. Not every evening and never staying long, but his presence alone marked a shift that the household staff noticed immediately. He asked Lillian about her day. She asked about his work. Their conversations remained cautious, superficial, like two people learning to speak a foreign language together. But they were conversations nonetheless. The villagers of Thornmere, meanwhile, transformed their view of the Duke overnight. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid him now nodded respectfully when he rode through. Women who had whispered about curses now called blessings after him. The rescue had accomplished what 20 years of dutiful estate management could not. It had made Alexander Thornfield human in their eyes instead of monstrous. But London society was an entirely different matter. 3 weeks after the rescue, a letter arrived from Lillian's mother. She opened it in the drawing room while Alexander reviewed estate correspondence at the desk by the window. They had fallen into this comfortable pattern, working in the same room without speaking, simply sharing space in a way that felt less lonely than their earlier isolation. Lillian read the first paragraph and felt her blood turn to ice. "What is it?" Alexander looked up, immediately registering the change in her expression. "My father," Lillian said, her voice hollow. "He's coming here, he and my mother both. They arrive tomorrow." Alexander set down his papers, his face becoming unreadable again. "Why?" Lillian read further, her hands beginning to shake. "Because rumors have reached London about the mine rescue, about how you risked your life for village children, about how we were seen together, working side by side. My father says—" She swallowed hard. "He says there are concerns about the nature of our marriage, questions about whether it's been properly consummated. He's coming to ensure his investment is secure." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "His investment," Alexander repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "He means you." "He means the alliance he purchased," Lillian corrected, trying to keep her composure. "The political connections, the social elevation, whatever other benefits he extracted from arranging this marriage. And now he's worried that the arrangement isn't proceeding as expected." Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the window with that rigid tension she recognized as barely contained rage. "What exactly does he expect to find?" he demanded. "Documentation? Witnesses? A signed confession that I've claimed my marital rights like some rutting animal?" "I don't know," Lillian admitted, "but my father doesn't make unnecessary journeys. If he's coming all the way to Yorkshire, it's because he intends to assert control over a situation he sees as threatening to his interests." "Then we'll simply tell him the truth," Alexander said, "that our marriage is our own business and his involvement is neither required nor welcome." "You don't understand," Lillian stood as well, her own frustration rising. "My father is not a man who accepts being dismissed. He arranged this marriage when we were desperate. If he decides you're not fulfilling your obligations, if he perceives that I'm being mistreated or neglected, he could create scandals that would damage both of us. He could claim fraud, demand an annulment, drag Ravenhurst's name through every court and newspaper in England." "Let him try," Alexander growled. "I've survived worse than your father's threats." "But I haven't." The words burst out louder than Lillian intended. "I haven't survived scandal and social destruction. I'm still trying to survive this marriage, trying to build something that resembles a life here. And if my father arrives tomorrow with his suspicions and his demands, everything we've carefully constructed will shatter." The silence that followed was suffocating. Alexander turned from the window, and for the first time since the rescue, Lillian saw real vulnerability in his eyes. "What do you need from me?" he asked quietly. The question was so unexpected, so genuinely concerned, that Lillian had to take a moment to collect herself. "I need us to present a united front," she said carefully. "I need my father to believe that this marriage is functioning as he intended. I need him to see a husband and wife, not two strangers maintaining polite distance." "You're asking me to lie." "I'm asking you to protect what we're building here," Lillian corrected. "Whatever that is, however fragile it might be, I don't want my father's machinations destroying it before we've had a chance to see where it leads." Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said finally. When your parents arrive, I will play the role of devoted husband. I will be attentive, courteous, and convincingly besotted. But understand this, Lillian. It was the first time he had used her given name since their wedding night. When they leave, we return to our own terms. Whatever happens between us happens because we choose it, not because your father demands it. Relief flooded through her. Agreed. And if he pushes too far, Alexander added, steel entering his voice, if he dares to insult you or treat you as his property to be inspected and evaluated, I will remove him from Ravenhurst by force if necessary. Family or not, I will not tolerate cruelty toward my wife under my own roof. My wife. The words carried a weight they hadn't held before, a claim that was both protective and possessive in a way that made Lillian's heart race. Thank you, she whispered. Alexander nodded once, then returned to his desk and his correspondence, signaling the conversation was over. But Lillian noticed that his hands weren't quite steady as he picked up his pen, and she wondered if he was as unsettled by this development as she was. Lord and Lady Harrow arrived the following afternoon in a carriage that looked deliberately ostentatious against Ravenhurst's austere surroundings. Lillian stood in the entrance hall with Alexander beside her, forcing herself to breathe normally as her parents descended. Her mother looked older than Lillian remembered, worry lines etched deeper around her eyes. Her father looked exactly the same, calculating, ambitious, and entirely too pleased with himself. My dear Lillian, Lady Catherine embraced her daughter with trembling hands. You look well. Ravenhurst agrees with you. Thank you, Mother. It's good to see you. Lord Harrow barely glanced at his daughter before turning his attention to Alexander. Your Grace, thank you for receiving us on such short notice. Lord Harrow, Lady Catherine. Alexander's voice was perfectly polite, perfectly cold. Welcome to Ravenhurst Hall. I trust your journey was comfortable. Long? Lord Harrow said bluntly. Yorkshire is quite remote, isn't it? One wonders how my daughter manages the isolation. Your daughter, Alexander said with pointed emphasis, manages admirably. She has transformed the household operations and earned the deep respect of the staff and tenants. Ravenhurst is fortunate to have her. It was a beautiful deflection, praising Lillian's competence while subtly rebuking her father's assumption that she needed managing. Lillian felt a surge of gratitude toward her husband for the defense. Lord Harrow's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the rebuke but unable to respond without appearing churlish. How lovely, Lady Catherine interjected quickly. Perhaps we might freshen up before tea. The roads were quite dusty. Mrs. Brennan appeared as if summoned by magic, ready to escort the guests to their rooms. As the housekeeper led them away, Lord Harrow glanced back once at his daughter, his expression unreadable but vaguely threatening. The moment they were out of sight, Alexander turned to Lillian. Your father is a bastard, he said conversationally. Despite everything, Lillian almost laughed. Yes, he is. This is going to be exhausting. Unbearably so. Alexander offered his arm, a formal gesture they had never shared before. Then we'd better prepare ourselves. Shall we review our strategy before tea? Lillian took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fine fabric of his coat. What strategy did you have in mind? Simple. We demonstrate affection without vulgarity. I defer to your judgment on household matters. You defer to mine on estate business. We present ourselves as partners who respect each other. It's not far from the truth, so it shouldn't be difficult to maintain. And if my father probes more deeply, asks questions about private matters? Alexander's jaw tightened. Then I will make it clear that such questions are offensive and unwelcome. No father has the right to interrogate his daughter about her intimate life, regardless of his role in arranging the marriage. They walked together toward the drawing room, still arm in arm, practicing the performance they would need to deliver. Alexander? Lillian said quietly. Yes? Thank you for standing with me in this. He glanced down at her, something complex flickering in those gray eyes. You stood with me at the mine. The least I can do is stand with you against your father. Tea was a masterclass in passive aggression and veiled threats. Lord Harrow positioned himself in the drawing room like a general surveying a battlefield, asking pointed questions disguised as polite interest. How were the estate finances? Had Alexander made provisions for Lillian's security should anything happen to him? Were there plans to visit London for the season? Alexander answered each question with perfect courtesy and deliberate vagueness, revealing nothing while appearing entirely forthcoming. Lady Catherine, meanwhile, kept darting anxious glances between her daughter and son-in-law, clearly trying to assess the state of their marriage through observation rather than direct interrogation. "You seem well, Lillian," she said during a lull in the men's conversation. "Happy, even." "I am content, mother," Lillian said carefully. "Ravenhurst is a beautiful estate, and the household is well managed. But surely you must miss London, the society, the entertainments?" "Not particularly. I find I prefer the quieter life here." It wasn't entirely a lie. London society had been exhausting and often cruel. Ravenhurst, for all its isolation, felt more genuine. "And your husband?" Lady Catherine dropped her voice. "Is he kind to you?" Lillian felt Alexander's attention shift toward them, even though he was still ostensibly engaged in conversation with her father. "He is more than kind," Lillian said clearly enough for everyone to hear. "He is respectful, honorable, and far better company than London led me to believe." Lord Harrow's teacup paused halfway to his lips. "High praise indeed." "Well deserved," Alexander said, smoothly joining the conversation. "Your daughter has been an exemplary duchess. I count myself fortunate in the match." He reached across the space between their chairs and took Lillian's hand, a gesture that appeared natural, affectionate, and entirely calculated to demonstrate their supposed intimacy. Lillian's breath caught at the contact. Alexander's hand was warm, his grip gentle but firm. She squeezed back, playing her role, and saw satisfaction flash across his face. "How touching," Lord Harrow said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. "One hears such concerning rumors in London. Tales of the Duke of Ravenhurst living like a hermit, avoiding society, treating his bride with cold indifference. I'm pleased to see those rumors are entirely unfounded." "Rumors," Alexander said, his voice dropping to something dangerous, "are the refuge of small minds with nothing better to occupy them. My relationship with my wife is no one's concern but our own." "Naturally," Lord Harrow agreed, though his eyes remained calculating. "Still, one must ensure that the arrangement we made is being honored in all respects. After all, a marriage is more than a legal contract. It requires fulfillment of certain expectations." The air in the room turned poisonous. Lady Catherine looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. Lillian felt rage burning in her chest at her father's audacity, coming to their home and all but demanding proof that the marriage had been consummated. But before she could respond, Alexander stood abruptly. "Lord Harrow," he said, his voice like ice cracking, "I will say this once, and I will say it clearly. Your daughter is my wife, my duchess, under my protection. The intimate details of our marriage are none of your concern, none of London's concern, and any further inquiries into such matters will result in your immediate removal from this estate. Have I made myself understood?" The silence that followed was deafening. Lord Harrow's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. He was a man accustomed to wielding power, to being deferred to and obeyed. Being spoken to this way, especially in front of his wife and daughter, was clearly intolerable. "You forget yourself, Your Grace," he said coldly. "I arranged this marriage. I provided the connections and resources that made it possible. I have every right to ensure—" "You have no rights here," Alexander interrupted. "You sold your daughter to save yourself from ruin. That transaction is complete. Your involvement in our lives ended the moment the marriage contract was signed. Now you will finish your tea, retire to your rooms, and tomorrow you will return to London with the understanding that you are no longer welcome at Ravenhurst unless specifically invited. Is that clear?" Lillian stared at her husband in shock. She had expected him to defend her, but not like this. Not with such absolute commanding authority that left no room for argument or negotiation. Lord Harrow stood as well, trembling with rage. "This is outrageous. I will not be spoken to." "You will be spoken to however I choose in my own home," Alexander said flatly. "Now leave. All of you. I find I require time alone with my wife." Lady Catherine rose quickly, clearly desperate to escape the confrontation. She touched her husband's arm, murmuring something about rest and long journeys. Lord Harrow glared at Alexander for a long moment, then at Lillian, his expression promising that this was far from over. But he left, his wife following, leaving Lillian alone with Alexander in the suddenly silent drawing room. "Well," Alexander said, releasing a long breath. "That went poorly." To Lillian's surprise, she started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that she couldn't seem to control. "Poorly? You just threw my father out like a servant who had insulted you." "He did insult me. More importantly, he insulted you." Alexander moved to the sideboard and poured himself a generous whiskey. "I will tolerate many things, Lillian, but I will not tolerate anyone treating you as property to be inspected and evaluated. Not even your father." "He'll make trouble for this," Lillian warned. "He has connections in Parliament, in the courts. He could do nothing," Alexander interrupted, downing half the whiskey in one swallow. "I am a duke. He is a baron with failing finances and no real power beyond what I allowed him to believe he had. If he attempts to create scandals, I will destroy him socially and financially, and he knows it." Lillian should have been horrified by the cold calculation in his voice. Instead, she felt something else entirely, a fierce gratitude that someone had finally stood between her and her father's manipulations. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander set down his glass and crossed to where she still sat, shell-shocked, in her chair. He knelt, actually knelt. So they were at eye level, his hands covering hers. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly. "You are under my protection now. I may not be the husband you deserved, but I will be the husband who ensures you are never treated as less than the remarkable woman you are. Never again." Lillian felt tears threatening and fought them back. "Why? Why do you care so much?" "Because," Alexander said, and for the first time since their wedding, his expression was completely unguarded. "Somewhere in the past few weeks, you stopped being an obligation and became someone I cannot imagine Ravenhurst without. Someone who makes this isolated, haunted estate feel almost like a home." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. Then the door burst open. Mrs. Brennan stood there, her face pale with panic. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but there's an emergency. A rider just came from the village. There's a massive storm moving in from the north, the worst they've seen in decades. And Lord Harrow just left the estate in his carriage despite warnings from the stablemaster. He insisted on returning to London immediately." Alexander was on his feet instantly. "How long ago? 10 minutes? Maybe less? Your Grace, the storm is moving fast. If they're caught on the moors—" "Ready my horse," Alexander ordered, already moving toward the door. "Send riders to the tenant farms, make sure everyone is secured, and get the household prepared for the storm." "Alexander, wait." Lillian caught his arm. "You can't go after them. If the storm is as bad as Mrs. Brennan says—" "Your parents will die out there," Alexander said bluntly. "The moorland roads are treacherous even in good weather. In a storm like this, their carriage will overturn or get stuck, and they'll freeze to death before anyone finds them. Then send riders. Send men who know the terrain." "Well, I know the terrain better than anyone," Alexander said, and Lillian saw the determination in his eyes, the same resolve that had driven him into the mine to save those children. "I will not let more people die on this estate because I was too afraid to act." He pulled free and strode toward the door. Lillian made a split-second decision that would change everything. "Then I'm coming with you," she declared. "Absolutely not." "You need someone," Lillian insisted, following him into the corridor. "Someone to hold lanterns, to help with the carriage if it's overturned, to keep you from getting lost in the storm yourself. You said I stood with you at the mine. I'll stand with you now." Alexander stopped at the entrance to the stable courtyard, rain already beginning to fall in heavy drops. He turned to face her, conflict clear on his face. "This could be incredibly dangerous," he said. "If something happened to you—" "Then we'll face it together," Lillian interrupted. "That's what partners do, isn't it?" For a moment she thought he would refuse, would lock her in her rooms and ride out alone into the storm. But then something shifted in his expression. Acceptance, perhaps, or recognition that she was as stubborn as he was. "Change into riding clothes," he ordered, "and bring warm layers. This is going to be hell." The storm hit with a violence that defied nature. Within 20 minutes of leaving Ravenhurst, they were riding through conditions that reduced visibility to mere feet. Rain hammered down in sheets, driven by winds that seemed determined to tear them from their saddles. Lightning split the sky with blinding frequency, thunder rolling across the moors like artillery fire. Alexander led, somehow navigating terrain that all looked identical to Lillian's inexperienced eyes. She followed, trusting him completely, her horse struggling against the mud that sucked at its hooves with every step. "There!" Alexander shouted over the storm, pointing to something ahead. Through the rain, Lillian could barely make out the shape of an overturned carriage, its wheels spinning uselessly in the air. Luggage was scattered across the muddy road, and the horses, thank heaven, appeared to have broken free and fled. They dismounted, fighting the wind to approach the wreckage. "Mother! Father!" Lillian screamed, but her voice was torn away by the gale. Alexander was already at the carriage door, wrenching it open. Inside, Lillian could see her parents, her mother unconscious, blood on her face from where she had struck something in the overturn. Her father conscious but dazed, his leg trapped at an unnatural angle beneath the collapsed seat. "Lady Catherine first!" Alexander shouted to Lillian. "Help me lift her out!" Together they extracted Lillian's mother from the wreckage, laying her gently on the least muddy patch of ground they could find. She was breathing but clearly badly injured. "Your father next," Alexander said, moving back to the carriage. But as they worked to free Lord Harrow's trapped leg, Lillian heard something that made her blood freeze. A grinding, groaning sound, deep and ominous. "Alexander!" she screamed. "The carriage is shifting!" The ground beneath the overturned vehicle was giving way, sliding toward the edge of a steep ravine that bordered this section of road. The weight of the carriage combined with the mudslide was pulling everything toward the drop. "Get clear," Alexander ordered, still working frantically to free Lord Harrow. "Not without you both." "Lillian, move now!" She ignored him, grabbing her father's shoulders while Alexander worked on the trapped leg. Lord Harrow was screaming now, in pain, in terror, as the carriage tilted further. With a sickening crack, the debris pinning Lord Harrow's leg gave way. Alexander hauled him free just as the entire carriage slid over the edge, tumbling down into the ravine with a crash of splintering wood and screaming metal. They had seconds, maybe less. The ground where they stood was collapsing, following the carriage over the edge. Alexander grabbed Lillian with one arm and Lord Harrow with the other, throwing himself backward with all his strength. They hit the muddy road hard, rolling away from the crumbling edge as the world seemed to open up and swallow everything behind them. When the sliding finally stopped, they lay in the mud and rain, gasping, barely comprehending that they were still alive. "Your mother," Lord Harrow groaned. "Where's Catherine?" Lillian's heart stopped. She scrambled up, looking wildly around. Lady Catherine still lay where they had placed her, mercifully distant from the collapse, still unconscious but safe. "She's here!" Lillian gasped. "She's safe!" Alexander was already on his feet again, assessing the situation with the same grim efficiency he brought to every crisis. "We can't stay here. This whole section of road is unstable. We need to move inland, away from the ravine." "My leg," Lord Harrow said through gritted teeth. "I can't walk." "Then I'll carry you," Alexander said flatly. "Lillian, can you handle your mother?" It was insane. Lady Catherine was unconscious and dead weight. Lillian was exhausted, soaked to the bone, shaking from adrenaline and cold. But she looked at her husband, this man who had just saved all of them from certain death, and found strength she didn't know she possessed. "Yes," she said, "I can do it." What followed was a nightmare trek through the storm. Alexander carried Lord Harrow across his shoulders like a sack of grain, fighting the wind and mud for every step. Lillian dragged her mother inch by agonizing inch, using a technique Mrs. Patterson had once demonstrated for moving heavy flour sacks. Grip under the arms, pull, rest, repeat. The rain battered them. The wind tried to knock them down. Lightning illuminated their struggle in brief, hellish flashes. But Alexander kept moving forward, and Lillian followed, and somehow, impossibly, they made it to the old shepherd's cottage that Alexander had been navigating toward all along. The structure was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, unused for years but still standing. Alexander kicked the door open and dragged Lord Harrow inside. Lillian followed with her mother, collapsing against the wall the moment she was across the threshold. "Fire!" Alexander gasped. "We need fire, or we'll all die of exposure." He was already moving, his hands shaking from exhaustion as he gathered the dried wood someone had left stacked in the corner. Within minutes, faster than seemed possible, he had flames crackling in the old hearth, spreading blessed warmth through the small space. Lillian checked her mother first. Still breathing, still unconscious, the head wound bleeding but not catastrophically. Then her father, whose leg was clearly broken but whose color was improving now that they were out of the storm. "You saved us," Lord Harrow said, staring at Alexander with something like shock. "You came after us. After everything I said, every threat I made, you risked your life to save us." Alexander didn't look at him, too busy tending the fire and checking the cottage for additional supplies. "You're my wife's parents," he said shortly. "What did you expect me to do?" "I expected you to let us die," Lord Harrow admitted, his voice cracking. "I would have in your position, after the way I treated you both, the things I said." "Then you're a worse man than I thought," Alexander interrupted coldly. "I don't abandon people to storms and accidents, regardless of what they've done to me. That's not who I am." Lillian watched her father's face crumble. This proud, manipulative man confronted with the reality that the monster he had sold his daughter to was more honorable than he could ever claim to be. "Lillian," Lord Harrow reached for his daughter's hand. "I'm sorry for everything, for forcing this marriage, for treating you like property, for—" "Save your strength," Lillian said, not unkindly but not with forgiveness either. "We'll discuss this when we're all safe at Ravenhurst." The storm raged outside for hours. They huddled in that tiny cottage, kept alive by Alexander's preparedness and determination. He had found blankets in a trunk, dusty but usable. He had coaxed Lady Catherine back to consciousness, checking her for signs of serious head trauma. He had splinted Lord Harrow's leg with wood from broken furniture. And through it all, Lillian watched her husband work with calm efficiency. This man whom society called cursed and dangerous, proving himself to be the bravest, most capable person she had ever known. Finally, near dawn, the storm began to break. "The weather's clearing," Alexander said, peering through the cottage's single window. "But we need to move quickly. Your mother needs a doctor. Your father needs proper care. I'll ride back to Ravenhurst for help." "Not alone," Lillian said immediately. "Someone has to stay with your parents." "Then we go together," Lillian insisted. "We leave them with supplies, block the door against wind, and we ride together for help. I'm not losing you to another accident because you insisted on being noble alone." Alexander looked like he wanted to argue, but then he glanced at Lord and Lady Harrow. Broken, humbled, dependent on the mercy of the man they had tried to control, and something in his expression softened. "Together, then," he agreed quietly. They made their parents as comfortable as possible, stoked the fire high, and rode back to Ravenhurst through muddy dawn light. And as they crested the final hill overlooking the estate, both of them exhausted beyond measure, covered in mud and blood and rain, Lillian realized something that should have terrified her. She had fallen in love with her husband, not the careful affection of a strategic marriage, not the gratitude of protection offered, but real, fierce, undeniable love for a man who would ride into storms and face down his worst fears to protect the people under his care. The question was whether the Duke of Ravenhurst could ever let himself love her back. The question hung in the air between them as they rode through the breaking dawn, but Lillian kept it locked behind her teeth. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, especially when exhaustion made every emotion feel magnified and raw. By the time they reached Ravenhurst, the household was in organized chaos. Mrs. Brennan had mobilized the entire staff in preparation for the storm, and now servants poured into the courtyard at the sight of the Duke and Duchess returning covered in mud and barely able to stay upright in their saddles. "Send riders to the old shepherd's cottage on the North Road," Alexander barked out orders, even as Thomas Hewitt helped him dismount. "Lord and Lady Harrow are there, both injured. Bring the doctor, warm blankets, and a cart that can handle the mud. Move quickly." The men scattered to obey. Mrs. Brennan appeared with heated blankets and an expression that somehow managed to convey both relief and exasperation. "Your Grace, you're half dead on your feet. Inside, both of you, before you collapse in my courtyard." "My parents," Lillian began. "We'll be here within 2 hours," the housekeeper interrupted firmly, "and they'll need you alive and coherent to care for them. Now move." It was a measure of their exhaustion that neither Alexander nor Lillian argued. They stumbled inside, leaving trails of muddy water across the polished floors, and allowed themselves to be separated to their respective chambers. Mary helped Lillian out of her sodden riding clothes with gentle efficiency, gasping at the bruises already forming across her mistress's shoulders and back. "Your Grace, you're hurt. Should I send for the doctor when he arrives?" "No," Lillian said, too tired to care about the pain. "Just draw a bath, as hot as you can make it." She sank into the steaming water and let the heat seep into muscles that screamed with every movement. Her mind kept replaying the night, the storm, the carriage sliding toward the ravine, Alexander's impossible strength carrying her father while she dragged her mother through hell, the way he had looked at her in the cottage, something shifting in those gray eyes that had been cold for so long. She had fallen in love with him. The realization hadn't changed. It sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable and terrifying. Because loving Alexander Thornfield meant loving a man who believed himself cursed, who had spent 20 years pushing away anyone who tried to get close, who might never allow himself to feel anything beyond duty and obligation. But she had seen him risk everything for people who had treated him with contempt. She had seen him face his worst nightmare in that mine and emerge stronger. She had seen the man beneath the armor, and there was no going back from that knowledge. The question was what she intended to do about it. By the time Lillian dressed and made her way downstairs, her parents had arrived. The doctor, a competent man named Whitmore, who served the village and surrounding estates, was attending to Lady Catherine in one of the guest rooms. Lord Harrow had been settled in another chamber, his broken leg properly set and splinted, his color improved, but his spirit clearly shaken. Lillian found Alexander in the library, standing by the window with a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the storm-ravaged landscape. He had changed into dry clothes, but still looked haggard, the exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "How are they?" he asked without turning around. "Mother has a severe concussion, but the doctor believes she'll recover fully with rest. Father's leg was a clean break, painful, but not life-threatening. They'll both need to stay at Ravenhurst for several weeks at minimum." Alexander's shoulders tensed. "I see. Well, I know having them here is not what either of us wanted," Lillian said carefully. "But they have nowhere else to go. Their carriage is destroyed, they're in no condition to travel, and—" "They're your parents," Alexander interrupted, finally turning to face her. "Of course they'll stay, as long as necessary. I would never turn away injured people, regardless of our complicated history." He looked at her properly for the first time since they had separated in the courtyard, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Not the usual careful distance, but something raw and unguarded. "Lillian," he said quietly, setting down his glass. "What you did last night, following me into that storm, helping to save your parents even after everything your father put you through, that took remarkable courage." "No more than what you've been doing for 20 years, Lillian replied. "Saving estates, rescuing children, riding into storms for people who don't deserve your mercy. You're the bravest person I've ever known, Alexander." He flinched as if she had struck him. "I'm not brave. I'm terrified every moment of every day that something I do will cause more tragedy. That's not courage. That's cowardice dressed up as duty." "Then what do you call last night?" Lillian challenged, moving closer. "What do you call going into that mine? What do you call 20 years of rebuilding an estate from ruins while carrying grief that would have destroyed a lesser man?" "Penance," Alexander said flatly, "trying to balance the scales for all the people I've failed." "That's not how life works," Lillian said, frustration bleeding into her voice. "You can't earn your way out of grief. You can't perform enough good deeds to undo tragedy. At some point, Alexander, you have to accept that you're allowed to live. Not just exist, not just endure. Actually live." "I don't know how," he admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her heart. "I don't remember how to do anything except survive." Lillian closed the remaining distance between them, reaching up to touch his scarred face with gentle fingers. He froze at the contact, his entire body going rigid. "Then let me teach you," she whispered. "Let me show you what it means to build something instead of just preventing disaster. Please, Alexander, let me in." For a long moment, he simply stared at her, conflict warring across his features. Then, slowly, tentatively, he raised his own hand to cover hers where it rested against his cheek. "I don't want to hurt you," he said roughly. "Everything I care about gets destroyed. I couldn't survive being the cause of your pain." "You won't be," Lillian promised. "The only thing that's hurting me right now is watching you suffer alone when you don't have to." Alexander's eyes closed, and she felt the tremor that ran through him. 20 years of isolation and self-punishment cracking under the weight of someone offering genuine care without conditions or expectations. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "That's not your decision to make," Lillian said firmly. "I choose to be here. I choose to stand with you, and I'm not going anywhere, no matter how hard you try to push me away." When Alexander opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I'm afraid," he admitted. "I'm so afraid of letting you close and having fate take you away like it took everyone else." "Life doesn't work that way," Lillian said gently. "There are no curses, Alexander. Only tragedy and chance and the choices we make in response. You've been choosing isolation for 20 years. Maybe it's time to choose something different." "What if I don't know how?" "Then we learn together," Lillian said. "One day at a time. No expectations, no pressure, just together." The word hung between them, loaded with possibility and promise. Then Alexander did something that shocked them both. He pulled her into his arms and held her, his face buried in her hair, his entire body shaking with emotion he had suppressed for decades. "I'm tired," he whispered against her temple. "I'm so tired of being alone." "Then stop," Lillian whispered back, wrapping her arms around him and holding tight. "Stop being alone. I'm right here." They stood like that for a long time, two people who had been forced together by circumstances beyond their control, discovering that sometimes the cruelest arrangements could lead to the most unexpected grace. The days that followed brought changes that rippled through Ravenhurst like stones thrown into still water. Alexander didn't transform overnight into a warm, openly affectionate husband. That would have been impossible and false. But he stopped avoiding Lillian. He began seeking out her company deliberately, asking her opinion on estate matters, inviting her to ride the boundary with him in the mornings. They took meals together. They worked in the library side by side. They fell into conversations that lasted hours, discussing everything from estate management to philosophy to the books they had both loved as children. And slowly, carefully, Alexander began to open the locked chambers of his past. He showed her Edmund's room, preserved exactly as it had been the day he died, a shrine to grief that Alexander had maintained for 20 years. They stood together in that dusty space, surrounded by a dead boy's possessions, and Alexander told stories about his brother. Not just the tragedy, but the life. Edmund's terrible jokes, his enthusiasm for mathematics, the way he used to sneak kitchen sweets and blame the household dogs. "He would have liked you," Alexander said, running his fingers along the spine of a book on Edmund's desk. "He always said I needed someone who wouldn't tolerate my brooding. He sounds wise beyond his years." "He was insufferable, actually," Alexander said, but there was warmth in his voice, real warmth, not the cold distance she had grown accustomed to. Brilliant and reckless and utterly convinced he could solve every problem through sheer enthusiasm. "Like someone else I know," Lillian said pointedly. Alexander glanced at her, surprised. Then something that might have been a real smile flickered across his face. "I suppose we were more alike than I wanted to admit. Perhaps that's why his death felt like losing part of myself." They left Edmund's room together, and Lillian noticed that Alexander didn't lock the door behind them. A small gesture, but significant. A man beginning to accept that remembrance didn't require isolation. Lord and Lady Harrow, meanwhile, witnessed these changes with growing amazement. Lady Catherine recovered slowly, spending most of her time resting under doctor's orders. But she watched her daughter with sharp maternal eyes, recognizing the transformation in Lillian, the confidence, the happiness, the way she moved through Ravenhurst Hall, not as a prisoner, but as someone who genuinely belonged. Lord Harrow's transformation was more dramatic. Confined to bed with his broken leg, he had nothing to do except think about how close he had come to dying and who had saved him. The proud, manipulative man who had arrived at Ravenhurst to assert control had been humbled by a storm, and by the grace of the son-in-law, he had tried to dominate. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the accident, Lord Harrow summoned both Alexander and Lillian to his chambers. "Sit." He gestured to chairs near his bed, his expression uncharacteristically subdued. "Please, I need to say something." They sat warily, neither trusting this version of Lord Harrow who seemed almost human. "I've had considerable time to reflect," he began, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed, "about my choices, about what I did to you both. I told myself I was securing my daughter's future, but the truth is far uglier. I was saving myself from ruin, and I used Lillian as currency to do it." "Father," Lillian began, but he raised a hand. "Let me finish, please. This needs to be said." He looked at Alexander directly. "Your Grace, I judged you based on rumors and reputation. I saw you as a convenience, a wealthy recluse who would take my daughter off my hands while solving my financial problems. I never once considered that you might be a decent man who deserved better than my manipulation." Alexander's expression remained carefully neutral. "Go on." "You saved my life," Lord Harrow said bluntly. "You and Lillian both. You rode into a storm that could have killed you to rescue people who had treated you with contempt and suspicion. And not just rescued, carried me on your back through hell while my daughter dragged her mother to safety. That kind of courage, that kind of honor. I've never possessed it. I'm not sure I would have done the same in your position." "We'll never know," Alexander said quietly. "The situation didn't require that choice from you." "No, but it required it from you, and you made the right choice without hesitation." Lord Harrow's voice cracked. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, either of you. But I'm asking for the opportunity to be better than I have been, to be a father worth having, and perhaps eventually a father-in-law you can tolerate." The silence that followed was heavy with years of damage and the fragile hope of repair. Lillian spoke first. "Father, I won't pretend the past doesn't matter. What you did to me, selling me without regard for my feelings or future, that hurt deeply and will take time to fully forgive. But I also believe people can change. If you're sincere about being better, about respecting the life Alexander and I are building here, then perhaps we can find a path forward." Lord Harrow's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, daughter. That's more grace than I deserve." Alexander remained silent longer, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "Lord Harrow, I accept your apology. I recognize the courage it took to offer it. But understand this, my wife's happiness and well-being are my primary concern. If you demonstrate genuine change, you will always be welcome at Ravenhurst. But if you ever again treat Lillian as property or attempt to manipulate this household for your benefit, our relationship will be permanently severed. Are we clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Grace," Lord Harrow said, "and entirely fair." As they left her father's room, Lillian took Alexander's arm, feeling the tension still coiled in his muscles. "That was generous of you," she said quietly. "It was pragmatic," Alexander corrected. "He's your father. You deserve the opportunity to have a relationship with him if he proves capable of change. I won't be the one who denies you that." But Lillian heard what he didn't say. That offering forgiveness cost him something. That extending trust didn't come naturally to a man who had been betrayed by fate so many times. "Thank you," she said, squeezing his arm. "For giving him a chance. For giving us all a chance." Alexander stopped in the corridor, turning to face her. In the lamplight, his scarred face looked softer somehow, less like carved granite and more like flesh and feeling. "Lillian," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her heart race. "These past weeks with you, learning to talk to you, to trust you, to simply be near you without fear, it's been, I don't have words for what it's been." "Try," Lillian encouraged gently. "Like waking up after 20 years of sleepwalking," Alexander said. "Like remembering that life can be something other than penance and duty. Like hope, though I barely recognize the feeling anymore." Lillian reached up to touch his face again, that gesture that had become familiar between them. "Hope is allowed, Alexander. Joy is allowed. Love is allowed. She said the word deliberately, watching his reaction. Alexander's breath caught. Lillian, Whatever he was going to say was interrupted by Mrs. Brennan appearing at the end of the corridor. Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but there are visitors from the village, the Fletcher family, the boys you rescued from the mine. They've brought something for you and the Duchess. Alexander and Lillian exchanged glances, then followed the housekeeper to the entrance hall. The Fletcher family stood there looking uncomfortable in their Sunday best. Father, mother, and the two boys who had been trapped in the mine. Tommy, the older boy, held a carefully wrapped package. Your Grace, Mr. Fletcher bowed awkwardly. We don't mean to intrude, but the whole village wanted to express our gratitude. For saving our boys, for riding into that storm for others, for everything you've done for Thornmere over the years. He gestured to Tommy, who stepped forward and offered the package to Alexander with shaking hands. We made this for you, sir, the boy said quietly. All of us together, to say thank you. Alexander took the package carefully, unwrapping it to reveal a beautifully carved wooden plaque. On it was engraved, to Duke Alexander Thornfield and Duchess Lillian Thornfield. For courage in darkness, mercy in storms, and grace in all things, with gratitude eternal from the people of Thornmere. March 1847. Below the inscription were dozens of names. Every family in the village had signed it. Alexander stared at the plaque, and Lillian saw his hands begin to shake. For 20 years, he had been the feared recluse, the cursed duke, the man society whispered about with suspicion and dread. And now he was holding physical proof that the people who actually knew him, who saw his actions rather than his reputation, valued him as something entirely different. This is... Alexander's voice failed. He cleared his throat and tried again. This is extraordinarily kind, thank you. Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Your Grace, you saved our babies. You've given jobs to our husbands when other estates were laying men off. You've paid for medicine when we were sick and food when harvests failed. Thornmere knows what you are, even if London doesn't. You're a good man, the best of men. Something in Alexander broke at those words. Lillian watched as her husband, this strong, controlled man who had survived unimaginable grief, stood in his own entrance hall holding a simple wooden plaque and wept. Not silent tears, but real, shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and long suppressed. The Fletcher family looked alarmed, unsure if they had done something wrong, but Lillian understood. After 20 years of believing himself cursed and dangerous, of carrying the weight of tragedy alone, Alexander was finally receiving the recognition he had never allowed himself to accept, that he was worthy of love and gratitude. Give us a moment, please, Lillian said gently to the Fletchers. And thank you. This means more than you could possibly know. Mrs. Brennan ushered them out tactfully, leaving Alexander and Lillian alone in the entrance hall. Lillian took the plaque from Alexander's shaking hands and set it carefully on a side table. Then she wrapped her arms around him and held him while he cried, for Edmund, for Margaret, for his parents, for 20 years of isolation and self-punishment, for everything he had lost and everything he had survived. You're not cursed, Lillian whispered fiercely against his chest. You're beloved. By Thornmere, by your household, by everyone who truly knows you, and by me. Especially by me. Alexander's arms tightened around her convulsively. I don't know how to do this, he choked out. How to accept that I might deserve happiness. How to believe tragedy won't follow. You learn, Lillian said simply. The same way you learned everything else, one day at a time, with someone standing beside you who refuses to let you fall. They stood like that in the entrance hall of Ravenhurst, holding each other while afternoon light streamed through the windows, and Lillian felt something fundamental shift between them. Not just affection or partnership, but something deeper, recognition that they had both been broken by circumstances beyond their control, and that together they might find a way to heal. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Alexander came to Lillian's door by invitation. Not for seduction or obligation, but simply because she had asked him during dinner if he might like to continue their conversation about estate improvement somewhere more comfortable than the formal dining room. He knocked softly, waiting for her permission to enter despite it being his own house. Come in, Lillian called, and he stepped into her sitting room to find her curled in a chair by the fire, wearing a dressing gown and looking more relaxed than he had ever seen her. "I wasn't sure you would actually come," she admitted. "I said I would," Alexander replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I'm learning to keep the promises I make to you." They talked for hours that night, not about estate business or household management, but about themselves, their childhoods, their dreams before circumstances crushed them, their fears and hopes, and the people they might have become if tragedy hadn't carved different paths. "I wanted to be an explorer," Alexander admitted, staring into the fire. "Before everything fell apart, I dreamed of traveling to places no one from England had ever seen, mapping unknown territories, discovering new species, writing books about my adventures." "What stopped you?" Lillian asked, though she already knew the answer. "Responsibility. Grief. The belief that I didn't deserve adventures while Edmund lay dead in the ground." He shook his head. "Foolish, looking back. Edmund would have hated knowing I gave up my dreams because of his death." "It's not too late," Lillian said gently. "We could travel. Once your estates are secure, once we've built something stable here, we could see the world together." Alexander looked at her with such raw hope it made her chest ache. "You would want that? To travel with me?" "I would want anything that brought you joy," Lillian said honestly. "Traveling, staying here, whatever made you happy. That's what partners do. They build a life together based on shared dreams, not obligations." "I don't have experience with partnerships," Alexander admitted. "Only duty and survival." "Then we learn together," Lillian said, echoing her earlier words. "No one is born knowing how to love well. We all have to learn." The word love hung between them again, deliberate and unavoidable. Alexander rose from his chair and crossed to where Lillian sat. He knelt beside her, as he had that day in the drawing room when her father had insulted them both, and took her hands in his. "Lillian," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of love poets write about. 20 years of isolation have damaged something in me, but I know that when I see you, I feel less broken. When I'm near you, the weight I've carried feels lighter. When I think about the future, for the first time in decades, I see possibility instead of just endurance." Tears blurred Lillian's vision. "Alexander, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know I'm not the husband you deserved. I'm scarred, inside and out. I'm difficult and cold and probably always will be to some degree. But if you're willing to accept those flaws, if you're willing to be patient while I learn how to be more than just survival and duty, then I promise you this, I will spend every day trying to become worthy of the faith you've shown in me." "You already are worthy," Lillian whispered. "You just need to believe it." Alexander's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm trying. You make me want to try." Lillian leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "Then that's enough. For now, that's enough." They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, closer than they had ever been emotionally, if not yet physically. Then Alexander did something that surprised them both. He kissed her. Not with passion or demand, but with tentative gentleness, as if she were something precious he was terrified of breaking. His lips barely brushed hers, asking permission rather than taking it. Lillian kissed him back, her hands coming up to frame his scarred face, showing him through touch that she accepted every part of him, the damage, the fear, the carefully hidden heart he was finally allowing her to see. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing slightly harder, Alexander looked dazed. "I've been alone so long," he whispered. "I forgot what it felt like to touch someone and not fear the consequences." "Then we'll remember together," Lillian promised. "One day at a time, one moment at a time, until being together feels as natural as breathing." Alexander stood, helping her up, and for a moment she thought he might stay, might cross the final threshold between them. But he stepped back, recognizing, as she did, that they weren't quite ready yet. There was still healing to do, still walls to dismantle, still fear to overcome. "Good night, Lillian," he said softly. "Good night, Alexander." He left, closing the door gently behind him, and Lillian sank back into her chair feeling both frustrated and deeply content. They were moving towards something real, something lasting, at a pace that honored both their damages and their hopes. The Duke of Ravenhurst was learning to live again, and the Duchess who loved him was learning that some victories were won not through grand gestures, but through patient, daily choices to keep showing up, keep trying, keep believing that broken people could build beautiful things together. Spring arrived at Ravenhurst Hall with a violence of color that seemed impossible after the brutal winter storms. Lillian woke one morning to find wildflowers pushing through the moorland soil, their bright faces turned toward a sun that finally held warmth instead of just light. From her window, she could see the estate grounds transforming, green replacing brown, life returning to earth that had seemed permanently barren. It felt prophetic. Lord and Lady Harrow had departed 2 weeks earlier, her father limping but recovered, her mother fully healed and remarkably changed by their time at Ravenhurst. Lady Catherine had embraced Lillian before climbing into their new carriage, a gift from Alexander to replace the one destroyed in the storm, and whispered fierce words about being proud of the woman her daughter had become. Lord Harrow had said less, but meant more. He had shaken Alexander's hand with genuine respect, promising to use his parliamentary connections to counter the remaining London rumors about the cursed Duke of Ravenhurst. It wasn't full redemption, but it was a beginning. Now Lillian descended the stairs to find her husband already awake, standing in the entrance hall studying the wooden plaque from the Fletchers. He had hung it in a place of honor, where every visitor to Ravenhurst would see it immediately upon entering. "You're up early," she said, and watched him turn with a smile that still surprised her every time it appeared, genuine warmth replacing the cold mask he had worn for so long. "I couldn't sleep," Alexander admitted. "Today's the anniversary." Lillian's breath caught. March 9th. 20 years exactly since Edmund died and Margaret followed. "Do you want to be alone?" she asked carefully. "No," Alexander said, and the answer itself was revolutionary. "I want you with me. If you're willing." "Always," Lillian promised. They rode out together toward the sealed mine entrance, carrying flowers Lillian had gathered from the greenhouse, early blooms forced into existence through careful tending. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made the previous winter's storms feel like nightmares rather than reality. At the mine, Alexander dismounted and stood staring at the sealed entrance for a long moment. The timbers they had used to rescue the Fletcher boys had been reinforced, the whole structure made safe, but the darkness beyond remained untouched, a tomb for memories and grief. "I always thought this place would haunt me forever," Alexander said quietly, "that no matter how much time passed, standing here would feel like drowning. But today it just feels sad, like a scar that's finally healed enough to touch without bleeding." Lillian took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Healing doesn't mean forgetting." "No," Alexander agreed. "It just means the past stops controlling the present." He placed the flowers at the entrance, a memorial for Edmund and Margaret and all the might-have-beens that tragedy had stolen. "Edmund would have hated what I did to myself after he died. The isolation, the self-punishment, the refusing to live. He would have called me an idiot and probably thrown something at my head." "He sounds like he was good at keeping you honest," Lillian observed. "The best," Alexander said, and there was affection in his voice instead of just pain. "Which is why I think he would approve of you, someone who refuses to let me wallow in misery and forces me to see possibilities instead of just disasters." They stood together in the spring sunlight, paying respects to the dead while choosing to live, and Lillian felt the final pieces of Alexander's walls crumbling. He was letting go, not of the memories, but of the guilt that had imprisoned him for 2 decades. "There's something I need to tell you," Alexander said as they rode back toward the hall. "Something I should have said weeks ago." Lillian's heart began racing. "What is it?" "I love you," Alexander said simply, as if the words were both terrifying and inevitable. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe that day at the mine with the Fletcher boys, maybe during the storm, maybe the first moment you stood up to your father on my behalf. But I know that when I imagine my future now, you're in every part of it, and I know that I've wasted too much of my life being afraid to feel anything. I won't waste any more time being afraid to admit the truth." Lillian felt tears streaming down her face, joy and relief and love so overwhelming she could barely breathe. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have for weeks. I was just waiting for you to be ready to hear it." Alexander reined in his horse and reached across to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I'm ready," he said. "I'm ready to build a life with you. A real life, not just existence. I'm ready to hope again." He kissed her there on the moorland trail, with spring blooming around them and 20 years of darkness finally giving way to light. And Lillian kissed him back with all the love she had been holding inside, showing him through touch that she meant every promise she had made. To stand with him, to be patient, to build something beautiful from the ruins they had both started with. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and slightly dazed, Alexander laughed. An actual laugh, rich and genuine and so unexpected that Lillian started laughing too, until they were both doubled over in their saddles with the sheer absurdity and wonder of having found each other in the wreckage of an arranged marriage neither had wanted. "Come," Alexander said when they had recovered. "There's something else I need to show you." He led her to the west wing of Ravenhurst Hall, the section that had been locked and sealed since Edmund's death. "I opened it last week," Alexander explained as they stood before the heavy doors. "With Mrs. Brennan's help. I realized I was preserving a tomb when I should have been honoring a memory. There's a difference." He pushed open the doors to reveal rooms flooded with sunlight from freshly cleaned windows. The dust covers had been removed from furniture. The air no longer smelled of decay, and everything had been carefully restored to functionality without erasing the history held within these walls. "This was Edmund's wing," Alexander said, walking through rooms that clearly pained and comforted him in equal measure. His bedroom, his study, his collection of ridiculous experiments that drove the household staff mad. "I sealed it all away after he died. Couldn't bear to look at any of it. But you were right. That wasn't honor. That was hiding." He led her to a large, bright room at the end of the corridor, a space with windows on 3 sides and a view of the entire estate. "This was going to be the nursery," Alexander said quietly. "When Edmund and I were boys, our mother used this room for that purpose. She always said it was perfect because you could watch over the whole property, keep the children safe while letting them see the world they would inherit." Lillian's breath caught as understanding dawned. "Alexander, I'm not saying we need to fill it tomorrow," he said quickly, vulnerability written across his face. "Or even this year. But I wanted you to know that I can imagine it now. Children, a family, a future that isn't just me surviving alone in this hall. I wanted you to know that you've given me back the ability to hope for things I thought were forever lost." Lillian crossed to him and took both his hands in hers. "I want that too," she said. "When we're ready, when you've healed enough to believe that loving someone doesn't condemn them, when I've become confident enough in my place here to feel worthy of building something permanent." "You're already worthy," Alexander said fiercely. "You've been worthy from the moment you rode into that storm without hesitation, from the moment you refused to accept my isolation, from the moment you looked at me and saw a man instead of a monster." "Then we'll wait until you believe you're worthy too," Lillian said gently. "Until you can look at yourself and see what I see, someone brave and honorable and deserving of all the happiness life can offer." Alexander pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head, and they stood together in the empty nursery, imagining the future they would build. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for the timeline. The letter from London arrived 3 days later, carried by a messenger who looked exhausted from hard writing. Alexander read it in his study while Lillian worked on correspondence at the desk across from him. She watched his expression shift from curiosity to shock to something she couldn't quite identify. "What is it?" she asked when he lowered the letter. "It's from Lord Ashworth," Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral. "You remember, the husband of that woman who hosted the tea party where everyone pitied you for marrying me?" "I remember," Lillian said dryly. "What does he want?" "Apparently the scandal I avoided for 20 years has finally caught up with me," Alexander said, but there was dark amusement in his tone rather than fear. "Someone in London, Lord Ashworth suspects your father's enemies, has been spreading rumors about our marriage, claiming I coerced you into it through threats against your family, suggesting that I keep you imprisoned at Ravenhurst, insinuating that the storm rescue was fabricated to cover up other activities." Lillian felt rage building in her chest. "That's insane! Who would believe such lies?" "London society believes whatever makes the best gossip," Alexander said grimly. And apparently there's enough momentum behind these rumors that the Crown is taking notice. Lord Ashworth, who, surprisingly, seems to have become something of an advocate for us, is warning that there may be an official inquiry. Representatives sent to Ravenhurst to verify your well-being and the state of our marriage. An inquiry? Lillian repeated, horrified. They would investigate our private life based on malicious gossip? They would investigate a duke accused of coercion and false imprisonment? Yes, Alexander said. Title or not, those are serious accusations. If proven, even if just enough doubt is cast, I could face sanctions, possibly even criminal charges. The estate could be seized. Our marriage could be annulled. Everything they had built, all the healing they had achieved, suddenly hung in balance because people who knew nothing about them had decided to weaponize rumors for political gain. What do we do? Lillian asked, forcing herself to think strategically rather than just react emotionally. Alexander stood, pacing to the window with that familiar tension returning to his shoulders. Lord Ashworth suggests we come to London. Make a public appearance. Demonstrate that our marriage is consensual and functional. Counter the narrative with visible evidence that you're happy and free. London, Lillian repeated. The city that had mocked her for this marriage, that had looked at her with pity and contempt. The thought of returning there, of facing those same people with her husband beside her, felt both terrifying and strangely empowering. I know how much you've come to value the peace at Ravenhurst, Alexander said quietly. I know London represents everything we've both fled from. But if we don't face this directly, the rumors will only grow worse. They'll destroy what we've built without ever giving us a chance to defend ourselves. Lillian crossed to him, turning him away from the window to face her directly. Then we go to London, she said firmly, together. We show them exactly what our marriage has become, and we make them eat every cruel word they ever spoke about either of us. Something fierce and proud flashed in Alexander's eyes. You're certain? Facing London society won't be pleasant. I've faced storms and mine collapses and my father's machinations, Lillian said. I think I can handle some catty aristocrats spreading gossip. Besides, she smiled slightly, I'll have the Duke of Ravenhurst at my side, and he's far more terrifying than any London matron. Alexander laughed despite the seriousness of their situation. When did you become so bloodthirsty? When I married a man who taught me that fighting for what matters is always worth the cost, Lillian replied. Now let's plan how we're going to conquer the social season and destroy every rumor those bastards have spread about us. They arrived in London 4 weeks later, at the height of the spring season when society was at its most active and vicious. Alexander had sent word ahead to Lord Ashworth, who had arranged invitations to every major event of the season: balls, dinners, theater performances, garden parties. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenhurst would not simply make an appearance, they would make a statement. Their first event was Lady Pemberton's ball, the same venue where Alexander had first observed Lillian defending Eleanor Grey from mockery. They arrived fashionably late, timing their entrance for maximum impact. Alexander wore formal evening attire that emphasized his commanding presence, the scar on his face visible but no longer something to hide. Lillian wore a gown of deep sapphire blue that Alexander had commissioned specifically for this evening, elegant, expensive, and absolutely stunning. As they were announced, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenhurst, the ballroom fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned, every eye fixed on the couple standing at the entrance, and Lillian could feel the weight of their collective shock. The cursed Duke had returned to London, and he had brought his supposedly imprisoned wife. Ready? Alexander murmured, offering his arm. Absolutely, Lillian replied, taking it with confidence she had earned through surviving everything the past months had thrown at them. They descended into the ballroom together, and the whispers started immediately. A susurrus of shocked speculation that followed them like smoke. Lady Ashworth herself approached, her expression carefully composed but her eyes calculating. Your Grace, Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure to see you both in London. Lady Ashworth, Alexander said with perfect courtesy. Thank you for the warm welcome. My wife and I decided it was time to return to society. How lovely, Lady Ashworth said, her gaze fixed on Lillian with obvious assessment. Duchess, you look, well, Ravenhurst must agree with you. Ravenhurst is paradise, Lillian said clearly, loud enough for the people obviously listening nearby to hear. My husband has created a home there that makes London feel provincial by comparison, but we thought it only fair to return and address some of the ridiculous rumors we've been hearing. Lady Ashworth's smile became strained. Rumors? About coercion and imprisonment and various other nonsense, Lillian continued, her voice pleasant but edged with steel. I can assure you and everyone here that I am precisely where I choose to be. Married to a man who has shown me more honor, courage, and genuine affection than anyone I ever encountered in London society. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either misinformed or deliberately malicious. The nearby conversations had died completely. Half the ballroom was now openly staring, watching this confrontation with the hungry interest of people who lived for social drama. Well, Lady Ashworth said faintly, how passionate. Yes, Alexander said, his voice carrying authority that made the matron take an involuntary step back. My wife tends to be passionate about truth. It's one of the many qualities I admire about her. He placed his hand over Lillian's where it rested on his arm, a gesture of possession and partnership that was impossible to miss. Lord Ashworth appeared then, relief evident on his face. Thornfield, Duchess, wonderful to see you both. Come, there are people eager to make your acquaintance. He drew them away from Lady Ashworth's predatory interest, leading them toward a group that included several parliamentary members, a few progressive aristocrats, and notably Eleanor Grey, the woman Lillian had defended at the ball a year ago. Miss Grey, Lillian said warmly, how wonderful to see you again. Eleanor's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Duchess Thornfield, I heard you were coming to London. I've been hoping to thank you properly for your kindness last year. You have no idea how much that simple gesture meant to me. The kindness of treating someone with basic decency? Lillian asked. That shouldn't be remarkable. And yet in London, it is, Eleanor said quietly. Which is why the rumors about your marriage never made sense to me. A woman who would defend a stranger from mockery wouldn't be held prisoner by her husband, and a man who observed that defense with approval wouldn't be the monster people claimed. She said it loud enough for the surrounding groups to hear, and Lillian saw several people exchange uncomfortable glances, recognition that their gossip might have been unfounded beginning to dawn. The evening progressed, and Alexander and Lillian moved through the ballroom like a matched set of forces, gracious when appropriate, cutting when necessary, always unified and clearly devoted to each other. Men who had sneered at the Duke of Ravenhurst found themselves confronted with someone who knew more about estate management, politics, and economic theory than they had ever bothered to learn. Women who had pitied Lillian discovered a duchess who spoke with confidence about running a major household, managing tenant relationships, and making independent decisions. And whenever someone tried to separate them, to pull Alexander aside for business discussion or draw Lillian into feminine gossip circles, they politely but firmly declined, making it clear that whatever happened, they faced it together. It was Caroline Winters who finally attempted direct confrontation. Duchess Thornfield, she approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How brave of you to return to London. After all the whispers about your situation at Ravenhurst, I'm amazed you dare show your face. Why would I not? Lillian asked calmly. I have nothing to be ashamed of. Of course not, Caroline said with false sweetness. Though one does wonder why the Duke keeps you so isolated. Why he never brought you to London before now. What exactly was he hiding in that remote estate? He was healing, Lillian said, her voice dropping to something dangerous, from 20 years of grief that London society mocked rather than understood. From the loss of his brother and his fiancée in the same day, a tragedy that would have destroyed a lesser man. He rebuilt an entire estate from ruins, saved countless tenant families from poverty, and maintained his honor through circumstances that would have broken most people. What were you doing during those same 20 years, Miss Winters? Besides spreading malicious gossip about people you've never bothered to actually know. Caroline's face flushed red. Several people nearby had stopped even pretending not to listen. How dare you? Caroline began. How dare I speak truth? Lillian interrupted. How dare I defend my husband against slander? How dare I point out that London society's cruelty toward the Duke of Ravenhurst says far more about its own moral bankruptcy than about any supposed curse or monstrousness on his part. Lillian, Alexander appeared at her side, and she saw both pride and concern in his eyes. Perhaps we should— No, Lillian said firmly. I'm tired of people like Miss Winters spreading lies without consequences. I'm tired of good people being destroyed by gossip while the gossips face no accountability. If there's going to be an inquiry into our marriage, then let's make sure the investigators understand exactly what they're investigating. A union that began in obligation and became something profound despite every obstacle London tried to place in our path. She turned to address the larger crowd that had gathered, drawn by the confrontation like moths to flame. My husband saved my parents' lives during a storm, she announced clearly. He rescued trapped children from a collapsed mine. He has shown me and everyone at Ravenhurst nothing but honor and decency. Meanwhile, London society has shown me nothing but cruelty, judgment, and a complete inability to recognize genuine worth when it stands before you. So yes, I choose Ravenhurst. I choose my husband, and I will face down any inquiry, any rumor, any attack you people throw at us, because what we've built together is worth fighting for. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone started clapping. Lord Harrow stepped forward, limping slightly but present, his expression proud. Well said, daughter. Absolutely correct. Behind him came Lady Catherine, then Eleanor Grey, then, surprisingly, Lord Ashworth himself, who had clearly decided that truth was better politics than gossip. The applause spread slowly at first, then with growing strength, until a significant portion of the ballroom was acknowledging Lillian's speech, some with genuine respect, others with reluctant recognition that they had been on the wrong side of this particular scandal. Caroline Winters retreated, humiliated. Lady Pemberton looked uncomfortable. The various gossipers who had fueled the rumors seemed to shrink back into the crowd, unwilling to defend their positions when confronted with actual witnesses to the truth. Alexander pulled Lillian close, his arm around her waist, and whispered in her ear, "You are magnificent." "I learned from the best," Lillian whispered back. The official inquiry came 2 days later, conducted by a Crown representative who interviewed both Alexander and Lillian separately and extensively. Lillian answered every question honestly: how the marriage was arranged, how she had been terrified initially, how Alexander had respected her boundaries, how they had slowly built trust and eventually love. She held nothing back, giving the investigator the complete truth, because she knew the truth was their strongest defense. When Alexander was interviewed, he apparently did the same, admitting his initial coldness, his struggles with grief, his fear of allowing anyone close, but also explaining how Lillian had changed everything, how she had taught him to live again instead of just survive. The investigator spoke with Mrs. Brennan, with tenant families, with the Fletchers whose children Alexander had saved. He reviewed estate records, correspondence, every piece of evidence that might shed light on the nature of the Thornfield marriage. 3 days later, he delivered his conclusion in Lord Ashworth's drawing room, with both Alexander and Lillian present. "Your Graces," the investigator said formally, "I have completed my inquiry into the circumstances of your marriage. Based on all evidence gathered, testimony from household staff, estate workers, family members, and both of you, I find no credible support for the allegations that have been circulated. The Duchess of Ravenhurst is clearly a willing and active participant in this union, showing no signs of coercion, imprisonment, or mistreatment." Relief flooded through Lillian, but the investigator wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "I believe the parties responsible for spreading these rumors should be held accountable for their malicious falsehoods. The Crown takes a dim view of those who weaponize gossip for political purposes, particularly when such rumors cause distress to innocent parties and waste official resources." "Who was responsible?" Alexander asked, though Lillian suspected he already knew. "A consortium of minor nobles who hold grudges against Lord Harrow," the investigator said. "They saw your marriage as an opportunity to attack him indirectly. They have been warned that any further slander will result in legal action." "Thank you," Alexander said. "Your thoroughness is appreciated." After the investigator departed, Alexander and Lillian stood in Lord Ashworth's drawing room, looking at each other with growing smiles. "We won," Lillian said, still hardly believing it. You won, Alexander corrected. That speech at Lady Pemberton's ball turned the tide of public opinion before the inquiry even began. You proved that the Duchess of Ravenhurst is a force to be reckoned with. We proved, Lillian said firmly, that together we're stronger than anything London can throw at us. Alexander kissed her then, not tentatively as he had in Ravenhurst, but with confidence and passion, making a public declaration in Lord Ashworth's drawing room that he loved his wife and didn't care who knew it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lord Ashworth cleared his throat from the doorway. Apologies for interrupting, he said with obvious amusement, but there's a rather large crowd gathered outside who heard about the inquiry results. I believe they're waiting to see you both. Alexander and Lillian exchanged glances, then walked together to the front entrance. Outside, gathered on the street, was a crowd of people, some members of society, some servants, some common Londoners who had apparently been following the scandal with interest. When Alexander and Lillian appeared, the crowd erupted in applause. Not universal, there were still those who looked uncomfortable, who clearly preferred their original narrative. But enough people cheering that it was impossible to miss the shift in public opinion. The cursed Duke of Ravenhurst and his pitied bride had become something else entirely, a love story that defied expectations, a triumph over tragedy and malicious gossip, a reminder that truth could prevail over rumor if someone was brave enough to fight for it. They remained in London for another 3 weeks, attending events and cementing their social rehabilitation. Alexander reconnected with a few old friends who had been waiting for him to emerge from isolation. Lillian formed genuine friendships with Eleanor Gray and several other women who proved to be more substance than society performance. But as the season wore on, both of them felt the pull toward home. Ravenhurst called to them, not as a prison or exile, but as the place they had chosen to build their life together. On their final evening in London, they attended one last ball. But this time, Alexander led Lillian onto the dance floor, something he hadn't done in 20 years, not since before Margaret died. Are you certain? Lillian asked as he positioned them for a waltz. You don't have to prove anything else to these people. I'm not doing this for them, Alexander said, pulling her close as the music began. I'm doing this for us, for the future we're going to build, for the joy we're going to create despite everything that tried to destroy us. They danced together in the center of that London ballroom, and Lillian felt like they were the only two people in existence. Alexander moved with surprising grace for someone so large, guiding her through the steps with confidence that had nothing to do with society's approval and everything to do with his own hard-won peace. I love you, he said, as they turned, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I love you too, Lillian replied. Forever. Forever, Alexander agreed, and she saw no fear in his eyes anymore, just certainty and hope and the beginning of happiness. They returned to Ravenhurst in early summer when the moorlands were at their most beautiful. The household welcomed them back with obvious joy. Mrs. Brennan tearfully efficient, Thomas Hewitt gruffly pleased, Mary bubbling with excitement about all the London stories she wanted to hear. But it was the villagers of Thornmere who provided the most touching homecoming. As Alexander and Lillian's carriage passed through the village, people emerged from houses and shops to wave, to cheer, to welcome home the Duke and Duchess who had proven to be exactly what they had always known, good people deserving of happiness. They love you, Lillian said, watching Alexander's face as he acknowledged the villagers' greetings. They love us, Alexander corrected. You're as much a part of Ravenhurst's story now as I am. That night, they finally crossed the last threshold between them. Alexander came to Lillian's chambers by invitation, and this time there was no hesitation, no fear, no walls. They came together as equals, as partners, as two people who had earned every moment of intimacy through shared trials and genuine understanding. Afterward, lying in tangled sheets with moonlight streaming through the windows, Alexander held Lillian close and whispered, I never thought I would have this. A partner who sees all my scars and doesn't run. A love that feels like freedom instead of obligation. A future worth looking forward to. You deserve all of it, Lillian said, tracing the scar on his face with gentle fingers. You always did. You just needed someone stubborn enough to make you believe it. Thank heaven for stubborn duchesses, Alexander said, kissing her again. Cool. Seasons passed at Ravenhurst Hall, each one bringing new growth and healing. The West Wing was fully reopened, no longer a tomb but a living part of the house. Alexander began writing memoirs, not of tragedy, but of rebuilding, of learning to survive loss without letting it define him. Lillian started programs for tenant children, ensuring education and opportunity for the next generation. Lord Harrow became a true ally, using his political connections to advance causes that mattered to Alexander and Lillian. Lady Catherine visited regularly. Her relationship with her daughter transformed into something genuine and warm. And then, on a spring morning 2 years after their wedding, Lillian discovered she was pregnant. She told Alexander in the future nursery, that bright room with windows overlooking the estate. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, processing the news, and she saw fear flicker across his face. Old demons rising one last time. What if, he began. No, Lillian interrupted firmly. No what ifs. No fears about curses or tragedy following us. We are building a life, Alexander. A real, beautiful life. And yes, there will be risks and sorrows because that's the nature of living, but there will also be joy and love and children who grow up knowing their father is a hero, not a monster. Alexander's eyes filled with tears. I'm terrified, he admitted. So am I, Lillian said honestly, but we'll be terrified together, like we've faced everything else. He pulled her into his arms, holding her and their unborn child with a tenderness that 20 years ago would have been impossible for him to access. I love you, he whispered, both of you. I will spend every day making sure you both know it. Lillian said, We know. Their daughter was born in winter, a healthy, loud, red-faced miracle that Alexander held with shaking hands and absolute wonder. She's perfect, he breathed, tears streaming down his scarred face. She's absolutely perfect. They named her Eleanor Margaret Thornfield, honoring both the friend who had stood by them and the woman whose memory Alexander had finally made peace with. Eleanor Gray was named godmother and wept at the christening. Lord and Lady Harrow attended, their pride in their daughter and son-in-law evident to everyone present. The Fletcher family came, and Mrs. Brennan and what seemed like half of Thornmere Village to celebrate the heir to Ravenhurst. But the most moving moment came when Alexander stood before the gathered crowd, society members, villagers, family, and friends, and gave a speech that reduced most people to tears. 20 years ago, he said, his voice steady but emotional, I believed my life was over. That tragedy had marked me permanently, that I was destined to live in shadows and die alone. I was wrong. He looked at Lillian, who held their daughter in her arms. This woman, this extraordinary, stubborn, brilliant woman, taught me that grief doesn't have to be a life sentence, that love is worth the risk of loss, that building a future doesn't betray the past, it honors it. She took a marriage neither of us wanted and transformed it into something I treasure more than anything I've ever known. Lillian felt tears streaming down her face. And now, Alexander continued, we have this beautiful child, a symbol of everything we've built together, hope emerging from tragedy, love triumphing over fear, life continuing despite all the reasons it might have stopped. So today, we're not just celebrating Eleanor's birth, we're celebrating the truth that broken people can heal, that cursed estates can become homes, and that sometimes the marriages arranged in desperation become the greatest love stories ever lived. The crowd erupted in applause, and Alexander crossed to his wife and daughter, gathering them both into his arms. Thank you, he whispered to Lillian, for saving me, for loving me, for giving me this life. We saved each other, Lillian whispered back. That's what partners do. Years later, when Eleanor was 5 and her twin siblings, Edmund and Catherine, were 3, Lillian stood in the gardens of Ravenhurst watching her family with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. Alexander was teaching Eleanor to ride, his patience infinite as she struggled with the reins. The twins were playing nearby under Mrs. Brennan's watchful supervision, their laughter echoing across the lawn. The estate thrived. The village prospered. London society had long since accepted that the Duke of Ravenhurst and his Duchess were formidable partners whose marriage was both genuine and unbreakable. And the man once called cursed and monstrous? He was simply Alexander, a husband who loved his wife fiercely, a father who adored his children, a duke who served his people with honor, and a man who had learned that surviving tragedy wasn't the same as being defeated by it. That evening, after the children were asleep, Alexander and Lillian stood together on the terrace overlooking the moonlit moors. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Alexander asked. "When I came to your door and asked if you were afraid of me?" "Every day," Lillian admitted. "Because your question changed everything. You gave me power when I had none. You offered respect when I expected domination. You showed me who you really were instead of the monster society painted." "What would you say now?" Alexander asked. "If I asked that same question?" Lillian turned to face him fully, this man she had fallen impossibly in love with, this partner who made every day an adventure in building something beautiful from broken pieces. "I would say I'm not afraid," she told him, echoing the words she had spoken years ago, but with entirely different meaning. "Not anymore. Not with you. Because you taught me that the bravest thing anyone can do is choose love despite knowing how much it costs. And I choose you, Alexander Thornfield, every day for the rest of our lives." Alexander kissed her then, under the stars, in the home they had built together from ashes and obligation and impossible hope. And the Duke who once lived in darkness finally understood what it meant to step fully into light, not because tragedy had been erased, but because love had proven stronger than any curse society could invent, any grief history could inflict, any fear the heart could conjure. They had survived the storms. Now they would celebrate the sunshine, together, always together. And that was the truest victory of all.